So boiling oil is a big trope, right? You see it in a lot of movies. It's not a thing, didn't happen, sorry. You can just throw boiling water and it does the same thing, which is hurt people. Hi, my name is Roel Konijnendijk. I'm a lecturer in ancient history.
Hi, my name is Evan Wilson.
Dr. Michael Fulton.
My name is Michael Taylor.
I'm Dr. William Short.
Today I'll be looking at naval warfare,
Siege warfare,
Ancient Rome battles,
Viking battles,
Ancient warfare scenes in modern movies and TV, and seeing how real they are. So this is the supposed Greek concept of thismos, which it literally means pushing. And about 100 years ago, a scholar in Oxford who clearly had rugby on his mind decided that this should be conceived as a literal mass shoving. We have no evidence of that. Nobody ever says that that's the case. But for some reason, this really caught on. And so for the last 100 years, it's been controversial. But generally speaking, I mean, people didn't want to fight like that. Spears are right in your face. So there's a lot of reasons to want to avoid this. So this moment where they switch from fighting in formation to going after individuals who are still resisting, that seemed very realistic for most of these fights. Make sure you can kill as many of them as possible, because that's when they're vulnerable, that's when they're not fighting back, so that's when you can just sort of spear them in the back. And that's exactly what happens in this scene. It's only very much later in Spartan history where they say we don't chase the fleeing enemy, because if you chase the enemy, then you're caught out of formation, you become vulnerable. But at this time, in the time of the Persian Wars, the Spartans had no rules against this, and indeed, it's a true story. You can't really dispute that, but in sense of the tactics and the weapons, it feels like a fantasy movie. Maybe 3 or 4 out of 10. If the old man's in range, why isn't everybody shooting? They're making all these people on the walls hold their arrow for a really long time, and these are really heavy bows, so it's exhausting. Armor is intended to keep arrows out. Bows aren't guns. They are meant as a suppressive weapon. You use it to keep their heads down. And so, of course, you would still use it even against people wearing plate armor, because even the feel of arrows sort of pinging off your armor or falling around you is going to make you much more cautious. Obviously, attacking walls with ladders is just a really, really risky proposition and usually doesn't work. If you believe they don't have either the courage or the strength to resist you, then you might try this. You just put a lot of ladders against the walls, swarm up, take the place. If you expect it to be defended, it puts you in such a position of vulnerability, approaching the walls one at a time, and it's just not going to go well. But obviously, it is a very common tactic. I mean, you can go to the British Museum right now and see depictions of people assaulting walls with ladders. Yeah, so I mean, the problem when you see this kind of siege scenes in movies is that they always seem to make it really easy for the attacker. If they want to go right up to the wall, they can just do that. If they want to bring siege engines, if they want to bring catapults or rams or towers up to the walls, they can just do that. It's like they're trying to make it possible for this place to fall. Whereas in reality, I mean, one of the most common forms of fortification is very simply, if you have the ground like this, you dig a ditch and you pile up the sand behind it. Then you build your wall on top of that. And now what do you have? The enemy wants to approach you from the front, they end up in the ditch. Suddenly the wall they're facing is much higher. If they want to bring siege towers or battering rams, they fall into the ditch. They would have to fill up the ditch first before they can get to you. All that time they're right under your walls. In movies they never do this because that would slow things down. I want to keep the assault engaging. That's why a lot of the tactics that they show you are actually too simple and missing a lot of the points that would actually be used. Well, firstly, that hill is much too steep, so everybody would die. But these horses would just slide to their deaths, unfortunately. But if we if we take that out of the equation, I always thought it was validated by the fact that he uses the light of the sun to blind the orcs, which means they lower their pikes at the last moment. So the idea is that he creates those openings that the horses need to see in order to push their charge. So you see them sort of wavering and breaking just before the charge hits, which is exactly the point. Like, that makes it conceivable that this could have worked. I mean, it is still a fantasy and they're doing many things wrong. On the other hand, it certainly hits a number of points where you're like, well, this is realistic, using sort of layered of initiative in order to overcome the defenses. Yeah, I mean, 4 out of 10, 5 out of 10. this is just wrong. I mean, I mean, what are they doing here? Like, this is, where are they getting the idea that the Scots in this period were wearing like leather and war paint? Like these are just like ordinary medieval infantry. They would be wearing chainmail and helmets like this, you know. They just deliberately made them into savages. Why would you make them into savages? They're sophisticated people. They had disciplined pike formations. So fire arrows are not entirely unhistorical. They did exist, but usually you would use them during a siege assault, for instance. Like you could use them to set things on fire, which is what they're for. So buildings and, you know, stocks and supplies, wood, straw, thatch roofs, because it would create chaos and distractions. This idea of involving fire in battle scenes is just something that Hollywood loves. I mean, you just want to have fire because it's a nice spectacle. Also, how would they have done this without the English noticing that there was a field of oil or something on the ground? Like, they wouldn't have like been like, oh, that's probably there for no reason. I'm just going to stand in front of it. They just do this, all these movies, they just sort of charge into each other like horseless lancers. They just sort of mash into each other, like no regard for anything. And then, like, when people ask me, like, so in a battle like this, like, how would you know which one is on which side? Like, how would you know who to stab, basically? Like, yeah, you wouldn't, obviously. If it went down like this, you would have no idea, which is why it didn't. As soon as your formation gets so messed up and so disorderly that the enemy are in your ranks, you know you've lost. Now, infantry would often charge into battle in the sense that it would run the last distance to meet the enemy, because everybody's afraid. Nobody wants to be there, really, because they know they're about to be in mortal danger. So you run and you scream to get yourself through that point and to psych yourself up and to know that there's a lot of you who are all in it together. But then you'd probably, by the best modern theories, you'd sort of slow down when you get to the enemy. And then you would start stabbing at each other in more or less even lines, because otherwise everything would you would just lose control. This is a joke. I mean, like, from the equipment to the tactics, like, none of this has any bearing on what actually happened, except that William Wallace was defeated. That's basically it. 2 out of 10 or 1 out of 10. That's one of the most common forms of ancient artillery, is these bolt shooters. They would shoot these big rods, these sort of metal bolts. They're very effective. They shoot further and more accurately than arrows. I mean, what is the point here? This forest is clearly very wet. It's not going to burn. It just looks cinematic. And they form a testudo, of course they do. I mean, it's not ridiculous. I mean, the Romans did have a formation like that, which is called testudo. And they did use it in a few occasions, when you knew you had to pass through a bunch of arrow fire and you didn't want to lose any casualties. But it's a desperate measure. So then you're stuck waiting, essentially, for the enemy to stop shooting at you. So in a battle situation, you wouldn't want to waste your time trying to get into that formation and then waste your time trying to get out of it again when the enemy's right there. Instead, you would just try to get through that zone and get into the thick of it.
Do not be troubled, for you are in Elysium, and you're already dead.
It's an endless debate whether those speeches actually happened, because it's hard to speak to an entire army full of people, especially without a microphone. But it is something that is very, very common in descriptions of battles. So the best we can do is assume that they did happen and that they were a very important part of it. The cavalry here, bizarrely, charges through a forest. This is a really bad idea. Your horses are going to break their legs. Like, you'd try to find open ground. I mean, it uses a lot of actual Roman tactics and equipment, so I guess 6 out of 10, but it's a mishmash. The whole point is just that they're just doing Saving Private Ryan. This is just made up because they wanted to have a scene like Saving Private Ryan. Resisted landings are not common in ancient warfare because they're kind of a modern warfare thing. Most of the time, they would just find a suitable beach somewhere a reasonable distance away from their target and land there, and then they would advance on their target. These are just stakes for show. Who are they going to stop? Like, they're not trying to land tanks here or anything. People can just walk through them. Like if you want to fortify anything, in antiquity, in the Middle Ages, in the modern day, ditch and a palisade. It's that simple. It's easy. All you need is a bit of wood and some shovels. And they haven't done it. They just put some stakes up here and there for no reason. Just kind of sprinkle some stakes. This kind of shield formation is total rubbish. I mean, come on. There's nothing like that in Greek history. They're not going to be like this overlapping sort of turtle thing. In the period where this poem is set, there was no mounted cavalry. And even in later periods, you rarely have people actually fighting on horseback. It's hard to work out how to use cavalry tactically. It's difficult to use it if you don't have very many of them. And horses are just very precious. It costs an enormous amount of money to maintain a horse. So you don't want to waste your horse on something like this guy and his hammer. It's charging altogether. They have no sense of order. And in fact, if you look closely in one of these scenes, just to the left of Paris, after the next shot of Paris running away, I think. The extra falls down on his face. I mean, I love that bit because it just shows exactly why you wouldn't want to be doing this, right? Because if everybody's running all together, you're just going to trip over yourself. Like everybody gets in each other's way. Like they're doing a beach landing, which is obviously inspired by an earlier movie. It has nothing to do with history, except that they have swords and arrows. Yeah, what do you want? 2 out of 10? So again, where is your ditch? Where's your ditch? You gotta have a ditch. Otherwise, they're gonna run those siege towers right up to your wall. You know this. And obviously, Jerusalem at the time did have a ditch, and it had a pre-wall and another ditch. So that you can't just put your siege engines right up to the wall. Of course, they start throwing fireballs. Stop it with the fireballs. Admittedly, it is realistic here that they're very concerned about not like trying to keep their siege weapons from catching fire. The defenders would try to set them on fire, and so it's very important to protect them from that, usually by covering them with wet hides.
Oil! Now!
So boiling oil is a big trope, right? You see it in a lot of movies. It's not a thing. Didn't happen. Sorry. So there's no evidence of it ever happening. There's no description of people being smothered in boiling oil, certainly not oil that's already been set on fire. I mean, you can just throw boiling water and it does the same thing, which is hurt people. Or you can just throw rocks. They cost you nothing, they take no preparation, and you throw them at people, they get hurt. It's great. So boiling oil is just needlessly elaborate. And you're burning fuel. You don't want to be burning things for no good reason. The account that we have of this siege, it says there was constant fighting outside the walls. And there were also assaults on the walls. This one's better than the other one, actually. Better than Helm's Deep. Again, they should have been digging ditches. Literally, all they do is just stand around carrying like spears from one point to another. You should be digging ditches, many ditches. Once your first ditch is ready, build another one. The female characters, other than the ones who've been trained to fight, are basically just sort of hiding in the dungeon and not doing anything. In actual sieges, especially when it was this desperate, I mean, they would just be expected to contribute. You know, women, children, old men, everybody does something. Because there's always things that people can do even when they don't fight. You know, go and carry arrows and stones up to the people on the walls, go and put out fires, you know, help with water and food, help with clothing and the wounded. There's no way you would just stick them away in a corner somewhere. These catapults are obviously in the wrong place. They should be on top of the wall. Like, why would you put them outside of the walls? They're going to be overrun. You can't move them out of the way quickly enough, so put them on top of the walls. That's where you put your artillery. So you can put your cavalry in front and it totally works if you don't expect your enemy to stand their ground. So putting your cavalry in front is a time-tested, you know, very common strategy, totally works, unless you're fighting ice zombies who are not going to break and they're not scared of you. You're just wasting your cavalry. So it's the right tactic for the wrong moment. There are probably several other battles in Game of Thrones where this could have worked really well. Should you find yourself fighting an army of ice zombies, so put your artillery on the wall, dig many ditches, just lots and lots of ditches. You can put, of course, your infantry in front if you want to confront them there, because that means that you will have several stages to fall back on after that. You won't sort of blow everything all in one go. But put your cavalry away from the main line so that once the enemy is engaged, once your ice zombies are stuck against your line, you can then swoop in from the side where they're not expecting you and overrun them. I mean, it's not going to really necessarily win your fight against an army of ice zombies, but at least it means that you are fighting them in a way that they don't expect. At least you will have done something with your cavalry that made sense. But otherwise, I mean, obviously it's all a bit silly. So, what should we say, 5 out of 10? I mean, this movie had an Oxford professor advising on the movie. You can see all the little details that they got, in terms of their dress, in terms of their tactics and maneuvers. Like, all of this is as good as we can get it almost. It's really, really precise, except for the fact that for the Persian army, they still went with this kind of slightly racist depiction of, flimsy warriors wearing eyeliner and things like that. It doesn't really reflect reality at this point. They would have been much more organized and much more heavily equipped. But this is just the way that people like to depict Persia in general and the East. It's just it leaves a bad taste in your mouth. In fact, throughout this period, the Greeks were the ones who fought like that. Whereas the Persians were known to be much more organized and to advance silently into battle, which was something that the Greeks were really impressed by. Camels, always useful because they scare horses. It's kind of a theme throughout Persian history that we use camels to scare off enemy cavalry. With this movie, like, all the equipment is just right. Like, these guys, these are the companions. Later on there are going to be some Thracians. Like, you can pinpoint very exactly who they are. The whole pike phalanx is exactly depicted accurately with all of the weaponry and the spacing between the men and the kind of blocks in which they maneuver and things like that. Now, this is obviously a bit silly. People wouldn't deliberately impale themselves on a giant stick. It's much more likely that they would just sort of stop in front of that and start falling back. And you don't actually expect a big pike formation to actually kill a lot of people, because people don't, they try not to die. They're going to run away from it. I mean, this is exactly as it says in the source. So this is our best reconstruction of how this battle happened. This is, in terms of ancient warfare, this is the most accurate depiction that you'll find anywhere. And I would give this 9 out of 10.
Kill them more!
Stop, no. Where are your missiles? No, this is where these battles, they would be about trying to disrupt the formation, not sort of to slam into it and hope it goes away. I mean, you'd be shooting arrows at it and throwing javelins at it to try and see if you can create some gaps in it. And then eventually, once you saw a weak spot, you might sort of rush forward. And so you could use your swords and your spears to try and create a hole in the shield walls. It doesn't achieve anything. Yeah, no, Vikings would definitely use shield walls. I mean, that aspect of it is realistic, except the fact that it's a 3-layered shield wall seems a bit excessive. That's a Roman formation. But you do have, obviously Viking shield walls are the way they would fight pitched battles when they did. So they would try to avoid pitched battles and mostly would fight in surprise attacks, ambushes, and sieges. So this is a rare occasion where, according to this scene, apparently they actually had numerical superiority, so then they could risk it. So this one I would probably give like 6 or 7 out of 10. And so this movie is entirely based on the romance. So not on the historical record, it's essentially just a fantasy story. This formation, in the historical record, there is something called the 8 Gates formation, which isn't described. It means a really elaborate infantry formation that has these sort of shifting shield walls, which is intended to trap enemy cavalry. And so that's what you're seeing happening here, is that they are using shifting shield walls to trap enemy cavalry. There are a couple of descriptions of it happening in a sort of competitive maneuvering, where 2 armies are sort of trying to show that they have more control and more discipline by competitively moving troops around. But actually there is no evidence that it was ever used in a battle to defeat anyone. It's much too complex. the amount of control that you would need over every individual detachment, the amount of coordination of each single man. Everybody has to know exactly where he has to stand for this to work. And none of them can, even a stray arrow killing one of them would disrupt this entire formation because it would create a gap in it. So it's just not feasible. That seems sort of wildly optimistic as to the abilities of any infantry force. In real life, if you could get that close to cavalry, why not just stab them? Just another one of those things that is based on a story, so how can you judge it? It's cool, it's evocative, but it's not historical. All these movies do this. They will have these archers lined up. They give these sequences of knock, draw, loose over and over again. But this never happened. You don't order them to shoot in volleys. When you order everyone to draw at the same time, some of these guys are going to get really tired and they're not going to be effective. Others are going to be like, this is too slow for me. I can shoot faster than this. There were no orders to archers to fire in volleys. The coordination required to do this is completely impossible. There were battle formations where you would have shield walls in front and then spears sticking out to sort of drive the enemy back. Obviously, the Macedonian pikemen are the big famous example. There are Mesopotamian examples from like way back 2000 BC. It wouldn't work like this though. You couldn't really form them in a circle. They would form up in blocks and they would maneuver in blocks, and that's hard enough. Once you're fully surrounded, there's nothing you can do, really. You're in big trouble. You can try to break the spears. Persians are known to do that against the Greeks. Their spears are longer, so they literally went up and snapped them in half by hand. But that's a desperation move, and it doesn't really get you anywhere. If you're in an encirclement like that of a proper pike formation, then you're just doomed. You probably surrender. Crushes in battle do happen. But most of the time, when people do get crushed into a small space and the dead start piling up, it's because they're trying to run away and they can't escape because there's a river or a ravine or a wall and they get stuck there. The panic of a trample, they do depict that very well. When horses turn up unexpectedly, especially behind the infantry line, you would give up and run. There is almost no chance that that formation would hold. The very unrealistic thing in this scene is that no one knew that cavalry was there. It's possible to hide, small units in woods or hollow roads or behind some geographical feature. But a large force of cavalry is going to throw up a lot of dust, it's going to make a lot of noise, it's going to, scare the birds and the animals. This is nonsense, but it does give a sense of desperation of some of these struggles. So maybe 5 out of 10, 6 out of 10. That big horn is supposed to be like a morale boost. And in that sense, it can work. A lot of troops before battle would try to sing songs together, just like sports teams might do. To hype them up. So that kind of thing would work for a horn. That shouldn't be confused with the idea of using it to give orders. That's a separate thing. The Romans were very good at that. They had a number of different trumpet signals, and the troops all knew, if you hear this signal, if you hear that signal, you have to do different things. But for instance, the Greeks, they had one big trumpet. When it sounded, you charge. If it sounds again, you retreat. That's it. Why would you do that? Why would they try to get the cavalry to slide over the shield wall into their own formation? You want the cavalry to stop in front of you, because at the moment that cavalry stops and is stuck in front of your spear wall, they lose all their advantages. They're not mobile anymore. They don't have that momentum anymore. The elves clearly have a very effective spear wall, and then they just duck under it and let the cavalry slide over it. What? I don't know why. I don't know what they were doing. Both the elves and the dwarves in this one have this double-layered shield wall. There are battle formations where you would do that, where you would try to stop cavalry by building these double-layered shield walls. This is based on a late Roman infantry formation where you put your infantry close together at the front in double shield wall or even triple shield wall. But in most battles, it's such a static formation, it removes all your opportunities to maneuver or to move. You wouldn't want to do that unless you were absolutely sure what the enemy was going to do was going to be running straight into you. If there was anything else they might do, you want to keep your flexibility by keeping your lines separated and just rely on a single wall of shields, because that will do most of the time. If you've got a static defense, you have your spear wall, the orcs are charging straight into it with no sense of self-preservation. That's exactly what you want them to do, right? You are safe behind your shields, and the orcs are going to impale themselves on your pointy sticks. All you want to have is for that to be exactly like that until the orcs stop coming. And then the elves just decide, no, instead we'll jump in front of that and put ourselves needlessly into danger so we can fight these orcs hand to hand. It makes no sense. It serves no purpose. Wedge formations are debated because on the one hand we have a lot of sources saying that wedge formations existed mainly for cavalry, but it's not entirely certain how that would even work, because most of what you're doing is just putting one guy at the front who's going to be exposed to everyone in the enemy line. So unless you've already made a hole, that wedge is not going to give you any advantage. It's just actually going to put you in a really dangerous position where you're feeding your men one at a time into the enemy. With cavalry, it's not clear whether it even works. It's showing you some interesting heavy infantry formations, but otherwise like 4 out of 10. So this is Kubrick trying to visualize a real Roman battle formation, which is this 3 lines in a checkerboard, which going into battle they would actually try and form some kind of line. We're not actually sure how this worked. It's also possible that they actually fought in these checkerboards, which would give them room to sort of withdraw between the ranks of the others and sort of maneuver in and out. When the front was getting tired, or when it was suffering too many casualties, and when it couldn't get through, you just pull them back and send in the second line, which would consist of more experienced troops, and then they would have a go. This is just an enormous mob of guys, much too deep to serve any purpose. Like, get information! Oh no, it landed on him! Like it bounced over the one and landed on the other guy. Oh, I hope he got his paycheck. Killed by a massive flaming corn dog. Excellent work. Hollywood just likes fire. They just want to have fire in their battles. They want to throw big balls of fire, and they want to have rollers of fire and balls of fire to disrupt formations. It seems to work in theory because you want these orderly formations disrupted. In that sense, it makes tactical sense. The casualty rate of these battles in Hollywood is ridiculous. The result is always that everyone dies. This is just not how battles work. You have a certain number of men in a formation, and when they start to see that things are going against them, or especially when they realize they've lost order, they're going to retreat. They're going to get out of there, and then they'll see what happens next. Or if the enemy is running away and they're being chased by cavalry, that's when you see the real casualties pile up. But in these formation battles, most of the time casualties would be quite low, 6 out of 10 for trying. It must have been an enormous effort to try and get all these extras trained to do this. And then they get rolled over by flaming corn dogs. It's a missed opportunity. That poor guy, I hope he's well. I hope he's still around.
Move the ranks! Move the ranks! I kill you myself!
Battles on ice did happen. There's, very famously, there's the Battle on the Ice, which is a battle in which the Republic of Novgorod warded off the Teutonic Knights. And so there was a battle fought on the ice, because obviously in many parts, if you're fighting in winter, the ice offers a nice flat space where you can maneuver easily. I mean, archers would have different ranges based on what kind of bow they were using, what kind of arrow they were using, and of course their individual experience and skill. Any kind of effective missile is not going to be too much affected by the wind. It doesn't necessarily matter that much where they end up, as long as they still have some force when they land.
Aim for the wings of the ranks, make them cluster.
I really like it, actually, that they use the arrows to drive them together. So they use these arrows around the edges to sort of drive the enemy into a narrow space where his numbers are negated. That would genuinely have been used in battle. So we say 6 out of 10. Okay, so you've got a huge line at the back, and then there's another line much closer. So there's like a mile between those two. What is the line at the back even doing? It's going to take you 15 minutes just to walk into the battle. This is the worst example of a Hollywood fight. You have big armies, but they don't act like armies at all. Slashing left and right, no one knows what's going on. There's no formations. It seems like there has been no preparation, no planning whatsoever. Everybody just gets together in a big mob and then slams into each other. This is such a weird scene because you see heads being split left and right, and then suddenly when the plot needs it to happen, there's a nice little pause and nobody will bother her for a little bit while she mourns this guy. It's very nice of them to let her do that. If you turn away from the fighting and drop your weapon in this kind of melee, that somebody's going to shank you. This is obviously something they do for plot reasons, which is totally understandable. It's 1 out of 10. It's a complete disaster of a depiction of battle. So that is actually a very, very good demonstration of how ditches are supposed to work and how a very simple thing like digging a pit can actually help you enormously. It shows the strength of this kind of fortification because the horses aren't going to try and go into those ditches. They're going to try to avoid that difficult terrain, and that allows you to force the enemy into where you want to fight them.
Smoke down here! Break through! Any way you can!
This is an absolute massacre. This depiction of the battle, it's reasonably accurate according to the accounts that survive. So we know that this was fought in a deliberately narrow space. They chose a place that was surrounded by marshes so that the enemy cavalry, which was very strong, would have to funnel itself along one small narrow causeway. If you're cavalry, you want flat ground because then you can move quickly and move freely. In the movies, everybody slams together and then it's just a huge melee. Obviously, in real life, there's only a few men who are able to fight, and the rest are just kind of waiting for their turn, more or less. And especially if you're in a battle like Loudon Hill, where you're funneled into a narrow terrain. So they chose their terrain really well, and that meant that even though the English had numerical advantage, they couldn't use it.
Retreat! Retreat! We're winning here!
For this kind of battle is realistic in the sense that they're just shouting and hoping that the men around them will hear it, and then those men will sort of pass it on. This is obviously not a perfect system, so he would just hope that everybody would follow his example most of the time. So it explains the tactics, the principles, but there are some other problems. All the infantry has too much armor, and all the horses have not enough armor. 7 out of 10. So this is Alexander's battle against the Indians at the Hydaspes, which is in modern-day Pakistan. It wasn't fought in a wood. It was fought on the banks of a river, which Alexander had crossed in the night. So for Alexander in particular, his cavalry is his trump card. He wants to be able to use his cavalry, and that means he wants to fight in open spaces. He wants to be able to maneuver them easily, and he wants them to be able to run freely. In a wood, it is too much for them to trip over. You can't maintain your cavalry formation very closely. Effective heavy cavalry also works in quite tight formations, like these horses are shoulder to shoulder. If you want to use that effectively, you can't obviously go through trees, so he would try to avoid them. All of his major battles tend to be fought on the banks of rivers or in open plains. This was the big battle where Alexander first encountered elephants. And they're depicting this, part of this really well. Horses don't like animals they don't know. You run your elephants at them, and if they haven't seen them before, if they haven't gotten used to each other, then the horses are going to run away first. You can see these elephants sort of barging into these heavy infantry formations, and everybody's like, what are these? How do we stop these? But actually, Alexander won this battle quite handily. The fact is that once you're over the initial shock and you have troops that are sort of battle hardened, it's quite easy to drive off elephants simply by throwing missiles at them, trying to get rid of their riders and panicking them so that they'll turn around and run and trample their own men, which is very often what would happen with these elephants. But at least the equipment, the tactics of the individual warriors and all that is accurate. You 7 out of 10. So hollow square is a real formation. It would be used on the march. If you were afraid that the enemy might ambush you or might attack you, they would be able to turn at a moment's notice depending on where the threat was going to come from. So chariots are a feature of mostly Bronze Age warfare. They are meant to carry around people who are shooting arrows, who are throwing javelins, and usually in very large numbers. But as soon as you have mounted cavalry and you've mastered the art of firing missiles from horseback, the chariot is essentially obsolete. It has no real advantages over just having lots of men on horseback because they're more flexible. So chariots in the course of antiquity just kind of go out of style. I would give it like 5 out of 10.
Position!
It's actually nice to see a bit of diversity in this scene. Like the Roman Empire obviously stretched across the Mediterranean into Africa, all over Europe. So you'd actually have people, you know, different skin colors, different backgrounds. So they dug a ditch and then they hit it. It does happen. It can be done. There is at least one battle in Greek history where the enemy has a lot of cavalry storming at the defenders, and the defenders have prepared the ground by burying these pots in the ground, just big vases, and then hiding them, so that when the cavalry charges, they fall into the pots and they break their legs. So this kind of hidden trap isn't completely unheard of, but it couldn't be done on this scale because you'd see it, right? I mean, the effort it would take to hide a ditch on that massive scale is just incomprehensible, and they would know that these works were going on because you didn't just show up on that battlefield that day and started digging, right? The Roman side would have seen them doing it. A goofy scene of a bunch of gladiators first making a nice defensive ditch and then ignoring it and jumping over it. You've made all that effort. You've neutralized the enemy. That was your goal, right? Why did you then go back over it? If that was your plan all along, why dig the ditch in the first place? It's just a silly big fight. 1 out of 10.
Don't run! We hold formation!
These are shields that are designed for shield wall formations. They're even like standing shields, so tower shields, which are meant to be set down in battle to form a static line of infantry. Usually you would use that to set up your defensive barrier, your bulwark, behind which you would then have archers, for instance, to fire at the enemy and trying to get them to attack you where you want them. So there are lots of different cultures throughout history that have used these kind of shield wall tactics with very large, very heavy shields. And then in the medieval period, they become more popular because of the rise of crossbows, where you start to get your armor and your small shields are no longer adequate, so you need these big barriers to protect you when you're doing things like reloading your own crossbow. So you get these kind of pavises, these big tower shields. They're setting up a catapult or a trebuchet, like very slowly, inevitably, because it's very heavy and difficult to position. And then you have to move these big balls, and they actually make a point of showing how heavy they are. You're not going to be able to fire those very quickly. Like, it's going to have a very slow rate of fire. All that time, they're just exposed. And you're standing there. If you get hit by these balls, you have no one to blame but yourself. Like, it's giving you every opportunity to do something about it, but instead you're just going to stand there. Well, tactically, it's very bad. They do have some of the equipment rights, 4 out of 10. This is 13 years after Saving Private Ryan, and we're still just like, no, that's how you do an invasion. This is a modern landing craft that they've dressed up to look vaguely medieval-ish. This actually happened in the sense that a French army landed on English soil during the period of the Barons' Revolt, but it wouldn't have landed in these landing craft, which are specifically designed to support a modern amphibious landing. And in fact, historically, this landing was unopposed. If the enemy's landing on a beach like this, there's only one way up the cliffs. Why would you go down there and fight them? You just block off that ramp and watch them starve to death or go home. It's your choice, really. You don't have to fight. You don't run any risks. It's better for everybody. These archers have a completely impossible range. They're firing from the cliff tops, which are hundreds of meters away, and they're firing up into the air as well to get maximum range, which, yes, it makes your arrows go further, but it also means that when they land, they're basically just falling. They have no force. So if you hold your shield up, they're just going to ping off your armor or your shields. Now these guys, again, are doing everything they can to lose this battle. You see a bunch of horsemen charging down at you, and instead of bundling together, you form a sort of loose line that the horses can actually get in between you, and you kneel down for no apparent reason. No, this is where you clump together, right? You form shields, you get as close together as you can, you stick your spears out. The horses can't touch you. They don't want to get in so close to an object that they can't get through, so they're not going to charge in. And then you have the range advantage because you have a spear and the guy on the horse seems to just have a hammer. So you're just going to poke them. I would give it a 3 out of 10. The landing craft are obviously wildly unhistorical. I mean, movies always love to use fire, right? It's going to be very spectacular, but obviously this would be very rarely used, especially when you're defending your own village. You're not going to set it on fire. Defenses are often built to try and pin the enemy in place. You surround them from the walls and you can fire down at them. Now this town obviously has no defenses at all, which makes it more difficult. Blockading the enemy, pinning them in place, that's when they're at your mercy. They did sort of portray that pretty well. Ambushing with archers is usually quite effective. You try to hide these people and then they pop out when the enemy's most sort of blocked and confused and doesn't know where they're going. But we shouldn't overestimate how lethal that would be. Unless you have a lot of archers, the enemy's sort of soon going to be able to regain enough organization to throw their shields up, and then your arrows are not going to be very effective unless you have overwhelming numbers. You wouldn't necessarily try to defend a village that had no fortifications, but if you had to, yeah, you would get up on the roof. The idea that the orcs can actually fire back at them and kill some of them, that's very unrealistic because the villagers are going to be completely in the dark. The light is down there where the fire is. As far as the orcs can tell, the arrows are coming from the night. You do some of these things like funneling the enemy, trying to block their way, trying to hit them when they're confused or when they're distracted. We give this maybe a 4 out of 10. The really cool thing about this scene is they have a ditch, and you can see how it works because they have to go into the ditch to approach the wall, and it means that the wall is very high all of a sudden. You can see this ditch forming a part of an integrated defensive system. The fighting for the ladders and trying to make your way onto the walls, and all of that, broadly speaking, is accurate. There would be a lot of engineering, there would be a lot of times in history when siege warfare is a place where a lot of technological innovation happens in a very short time. And you have famous instances like when the Romans attacked this Greek city of Syracuse in Sicily. Archimedes is one of the defenders, and he supposedly came up with all these different devices. They were so sort of new and innovative and strange that the Romans supposedly, towards the end of this siege, became so afraid of these devices that if they just saw a bit of rope dangling over the wall, they would run away because they were terrified that Archimedes had some new devilry to throw at them. So this idea of using strange machines in the defense of a city is historical. It's just that these particular things that they've come up with here, they literally don't do anything that a thrown rock couldn't do. These balls just make no sense. Well, the marble shoots, and when you know where the balls come out, you just step aside, right? If you get hit by these balls, you have no one to blame but yourself. It has some things, right? You got to give points for a good ditch. I'll give it a 5 out of 10.
We were ordered by Pierre to hold this bridge.
There's a siege of Limoges, which they've turned into the Battle of Limoges for some inexplicable reason. You can see the city burning in the background. This was a complete English victory. They just overcame a small garrison in this city and then murdered everyone. But there was no battle outside the walls or anything like that. So they're trying to tempt the French into attacking by killing hostages in front of them. Now, in the 100 Years' War, it was a fairly common thing for the English to provoke the French knights as a way to win. So several of their most famous victories at Crécy, Poitiers, and arguably Agincourt, the French knights charged when they shouldn't have. And this caused chaos. They charged into prepared positions, they charged into disadvantageous terrain, all these kinds of things. So the English clearly thought of this as a great way to win. And I think they were just trying to transpose this into the story of the Siege of Limoges, but it doesn't belong there. That one guy who just runs out like, what are you going to do? Like, my guy Don't. He's going to go up against an enormous army of charging knights on his own. You're going to die. They're saying at the beginning, we have orders to defend this bridge. Strategically senseless, because you can just ford the river. So if they're trying to stop the English advancing across the river, which is what I guess you're doing when you're defending a bridge, the English can just walk across. They don't form a formation. They don't have archer support. They don't seem to have any cavalry nearby. They're all going to die, I'm afraid. Shall we give it a 2 out of 10 because it got the date right? The spear throwing is actually something that's very realistic. They would throw their spears in battle, but then of course they would fight in close combat wearing armor, helmets, and swords and shields for the most part. You can climb a basic fortification. If it's a simple fort made of wood in particular, you can either throw a ladder up against it or climb it even by hand. I mean, this does sometimes happen. If the enemy's not very prepared for you, you might be able to sneak in that way. But if it's defended at all, this is going to go very badly. If these defenders had any sense at all, they would be forming a formation in the streets of this little town, and these invaders would have to try and break that formation, which they don't seem very well equipped to do. They don't have any armor, they don't have shields left. They just have their little axes. Well, in close combat against a spear, you're going to be at a massive reach disadvantage. Viking raids were obviously endemic in Europe in this period. Most of the time, Vikings would target obviously more vulnerable places. It's just not a very profitable arrangement or undertaking to try and attack a town that's defended. So you'd go after isolated farmsteads, monasteries, perhaps settlements that didn't have any kind of wall or palisade even, so that you could actually just walk in and take what you wanted. In terms of the actual fighting that we're seeing, this is a 3 out of 10. Actually, that marching scene has a very nice depiction of the fact that marching order would be relatively loose. You wouldn't march in very tight order because you just get in each other's way. When they would be marching, there might be as much as 2 meters between each man. So they're showing that really well.
And this is the Roman army amid our forests and swamps.
It's always very tempting, I think, for movie makers to have these battle planners either sketch it out in the sand or to have them pore over a battle map and plan maps, and the kind of top-down visualization of the world that we are used to just wasn't common back then. You would try and find a high point to overlook the battlefield maybe so that you would have the overview, but generally speaking you wouldn't rely on this kind of abstract visualization to understand the space.
When we cut off the head, the tail won't notice, and we hack it to bits.
Fundamentally, you don't need to split up this army even further, and because they're strung out along a narrow road, they can't support each other anyway. The front of this column is going to be miles away from the back of it. You're already in a position where you can essentially attack them with impunity. You don't have to do anything to these poor trees. This is the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. So this is a real event in which 3 Roman legions were destroyed by an alliance of Germanic tribes. They were essentially drawn into a forest where they did not know the path, they did not know the way, and then they were attacked from all sides. And so fighting them when they don't expect you, great tactic. In the account of the battle that we have, it was raining, so good luck with making a big fire in the middle of this field. There was a huge downpour which distressed the Romans because it made the ground all slick and slippery. It ruined their visibility, it soaked their equipment. They weren't able to operate well because it was raining all the time. They're using it to try and split up this formation, but again, there's no point. If you're coming at them from all sides, you're pushing them back into their own formation. And the closer they get together, the harder it will be for them to maneuver, to fight, to get organized. That's how you beat them. So making big lines of fire in between to separate them actually works against you, because then they have nowhere to go but directly into you, and they're going to fight all the harder. So this is actually a terrible idea, but obviously it looks really good on screen, so that's what we're going with. I think it deserves an 8 out of 10. Why not either let the archers handle it, or send out a formation of guys, let him try and break a shield wall on his own with only a little sword? He's not going to have a good time. Obviously, every time he has to fight someone, he stops. That's when he would get shot. And he has to do that several times and then find cover, which just happens to be there. He's immensely lucky. He's basically wearing sort of premium grade plot armor. Also, I'm begging movie makers to please stop it with the orders to the archers. This never happened. The knock, draw, loose thing, it's not real. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. The crab feeders men, the men in yellow, they actually have these swords and bucklers, which is a very particular style of combat where they have these curved swords and these very small shields. Usually they would have been made of metal, and you can actually use them both to guard yourself and to attack. So they have a very particular style of armor that you don't see in movies or TV series a lot. In terms of the fighting, it's just chaos. Everybody's just running around, engaging the enemy one at a time, hacking at anything they can see. It's very exciting to watch, but this is not a battle. This is just a big mess. 2 out of 10.
Tighten the circle!
These kind of protective circular formations are attested, though. You do get Romans sometimes forming a circle, but having them be in a single line makes it much too vulnerable. If even one of these men dies, the entire circle collapses. The enemy will be inside and no one will have any defense. You have to make that into a multi-rank formation, otherwise it's completely useless. They just throw themselves at these Romans like a zombie horde or something. It's kind of sad to see this kind of portrayal of Northwest European peoples, essentially. There's this tendency to turn actual well-equipped fighters into these wild, shirtless barbarians, because all the way back to essentially Greek and Roman times, we have this stereotype that the people from the north, people from the forests of Europe, are these sort of barely civilized wild men. They knew how to equip themselves, and wealthy warriors in all of these societies would have been just as well equipped as the Romans in this scene. So they are confusing two things. They're confusing chariots and scythe chariots, which are different kinds of weapons, essentially. Chariots were still in use among the most wealthy sort of warlords in Britannia at this point, but these would be missile platforms. So on those chariots, you would be firing arrows or throwing javelins, for instance. You wouldn't be engaging them in close combat because that would be a terrible waste of your poor ponies. These men would be heavily armored, not like you're seeing in this fragment. They would be carrying mail shirts themselves, they would be carrying helmets. Some centuries before this, there had been an attempt to create this kind of armored battering ram in the form of the scythe chariot. So you attach scythe blades to the wheels of these chariots in order to try and send them at enemy formations to break them up. This is something that we first see in the Persian Empire, but it never works very well. It's very easy to kind of either get out of the way or dispatch the riders and then essentially nullify this entire device. 4 out of 10.
Fire on my command! Ready!
Arrow loops are a way to make sure that you can project missiles from the wall while you're undercover. So enemies will find it very difficult to fire into those loops. That's why they always have this sort of wedge shape. They will let you cover a wide range of territory. These guys have been here, according to the story, for 10,000 years defending this gap. I don't know what they did. Like, they built the most simple wall they could for about a week, and then they, I guess, did crossword puzzles. This is incredibly primitive in terms of what it's trying to achieve as a defensive fortification. It's just a single wall. There's nothing you can do about them climbing up, breaking in, and getting to where you are. Make sure the walls have bastions so that you can cover the foot of the wall, so that you can defend yourself against an enemy that actually reaches you. The actual scene they show us is a 1 out of 10, absolutely worthless. Always looking for the crossbowmen and they're never there. There's like one guy, I think, among the French outside the walls who has a crossbow. But these should be quite prestigious warriors. The French's answer to the longbow is to have these armored crossbowmen show up in battle. They treasure them a lot and they spend a lot of time training as crossbowmen. And some of the wealthiest city dwellers would equip themselves as crossbowmen for these fights. You also have pavises, which are basically great standing shields that are used as cover, mostly for crossbowmen or archers. It's basically just a door that you're carrying around that you set down in front of you so that arrows will get stuck in the board, basically. So they're using those to try and defend themselves, but then they stand way behind it, which is great, I guess. Like, why did you bother then? No one's wearing helmets, which is also great. You can always say, like, oh, we want to see the actors' faces. There are arrows flying everywhere. You want to protect your head. The gunpowder use is so strange. It was known in Europe at this time. And again, we're talking about a siege, so maybe they were incentivized to try and use tricks. Guns aren't known yet in this period. The earliest gunpowder weapons, these cannon that shoot, again, the big arrow-shaped projectiles, occur several decades later. So I have no idea what they're trying to do here, but I guess it's because, well, they had gunpowder, so let's use gunpowder because then we can show big explosions and fire, and we always want that. It has nothing to do with history. This kind of weapon isn't real. And in fact, this fight didn't happen. 2 out of 10.
It's actually a really interesting clip. Like, it's got some really accurate features of how to approach a fortified position. Like, the attacking force is really quite spread out. They've all got their shields in front of them. They're trying to use screens to maintain in cover while they're advancing. So they're trying not to make themselves into too much of a target, which is really good. So the defenders here are using the most basic tactic, of course, that you can use, which is to try and shoot the people who are operating the engines. If you can get rid of those, then the engines themselves are just wood. The obvious response to that was to try and protect the ram itself with some kind of roof or screen, which is something that has happened since ancient times. I think it's supposed to be the kind of ram that you might use either to batter against the walls, like you can roll it back and forth and smash it into something, or to pry apart the stones of the wall. Throughout history, you try to use musical instruments or flags or fire to kind of signal to other people to make sure that they play their part in the battle. Having something really loud like a trumpet that you can hear over the noise of the battle and you can hear it at a long distance is a really basic way to do that. The one thing that I'm slightly questioning in this scene is that the signal seems to be just a simple single trumpet blast, so it's really simple, it's really straightforward. That could be mistaken for a lot of things. That could be a signal to attack for the main force. It could be a signal to retreat. And if this is the signal they use to summon the dragon, it implies they have absolutely no other signals. The Roman army units would have had like much more complex signals. They had a whole set of them that they were able to use in battle to indicate different maneuvers. So for instance, the Roman armies, you'd see these trumpet players with each unit and they would be able to give orders specifically. If you read tactical manuals from the Hellenistic and Roman period, they think these authors still think the most reliable way to convey an order is to just, you know, use your voice. Aegon and the other sort of leaders are actually getting directly involved in the fighting, and they become this kind of sort of symbol for their side, right, riding these dragons. And that is fundamentally really historical. There's a particular leadership style which is leading by example, which is very common throughout history as a way for these kings to demonstrate their worth as leaders. You know, people follow them because they're willing to take the same risk as the troops. Alexander the Great, for instance, was really renowned for this, like leading from the front, being the first into the enemy. But there's also the other consideration, which already, like, it forms the other opposite pole of that kind of problem of leadership. They often die. So it's something that a lot of leaders consider to be unwise because you end up, you know, losing a lot of generals or even, you know, monarchs or royal figures in battle. You want to avoid that. Well, you want to make sure you keep them out of harm's way. I would give it a 6. I have a personal grudge against the arrow commands. Like at this point, I have to get them to stop it at some point. So they have to lose points for that. And also, where's my ditch? I need one. That's bad. But otherwise, like, there is a lot of stuff here that's actually really good. The Orc army manages to block the river, bring the water level down, and that allows them to approach the city. That's both based on historical examples and something that would realistically happen as a way to overcome a city's defenses. One of the great examples of that, it's a story, we're not really certain if it's historical, but Cyrus the Great took the city of Babylon that way. By diverting the Euphrates through a couple of ditches that he had dug around the city, which allowed his army to essentially infiltrate the city through the dry riverbed. This is why they call him Cyrus the Great, because he knows the use of a good ditch. Obviously what they're doing here when they're shooting these catapult bolts hundreds of meters up into the sky to bring down this massive rockfall, I think that's more a narrative shortcut than a real tactic. It takes obviously a long time to kind of divert an entire river, so the only times that you'd be able to do that is if your enemy is already besieged and bottled up. What is going on with those walls? They're so basic. I mean, like, there's no cover for the archers, right? They just have a basic parapet. They don't have any battlements. They don't have any cover. They don't even have like a roof over it or anything. I mean, if you have, thousands of years to engineer your defenses, you can put a roof on it. So what you really want on a wall like this, partial barriers that go up to the full height of a person standing on the wall so that they can have cover or they can choose to be exposed in order to shoot arrows. When you realize as well that this wall doesn't have any kind of ditch or other earthwork in front of it, it's really relying on the river to keep the enemies at a distance. If they can approach, then even the defenders are going to be very vulnerable here. Horses actually can do some fighting. They can be trained to be an aggressive weapon or aggressive animal on the battlefield. In ancient times, this is very rare and very much worth remarking upon. We have like one story of a guy during the Ionian Revolt that Herodotus describes, a Persian general whose horse was also known to fight, so he would kick and bite. But in medieval times, I mean, when they bred these specific, like these purpose-bred war horses, they apparently were taught to be very aggressive and they were taught to fight on behalf of their rider. So it becomes more normal over time to actually get these horses to be quite dangerous on their own, essentially. Catapults were sometimes used to try and launch either diseased animals or corpses of humans into a besieged city to try and both create panic but also spread disease. And so you could use that to kind of, worsen the lot of the besieged. So this is a fictional weapon that they call the Ravager. I mean, it's very common for attackers to, instead of trying to get on top of the wall with ladders and towers, to just attack the fabric of the wall itself. So even in like ancient times, you have these beautiful Assyrian reliefs of siege scenes in which they're just going at the wall with shovels and pickaxes. Instead of picking into the wall, they decide to try and pull stones out with this kind of torsion force. I think that's weird. I don't think that's real. But at the same time, I mean, that's fundamentally something that does have a resemblance to siege hook, which is this kind of weapon that essentially a bar with a reinforced metal tip that you use in order to pry apart the stones of a wall. So, I mean, a lot of these walls essentially are just stacks of stones, right? Early walls in particular don't even have mortar. They are not stuck together. So if you can loosen the stones or crack them or bring them out, then gradually you'll form a hole. And especially, ancient walls, a lot of ancient walls are just mud brick. So if you smash into them with force, they just pulverize. There's a lot of fantasy technology here. On the other hand, in terms of its basic idea of a siege scene through a dry riverbed, I think that's a really interesting option. I would give it a 7. Like, they're actually based on ancient Roman ship designs very clearly. I mean, they're a little bit short and stubby, so they may have to be like Liburnians, which would make sense for the imperial period. They seem to have combined the Liburnian, which is quite a light ship, with the kind of towers and siege engines that you get mounted onto earlier, much bigger warships like quinqueremes, like these big 5s that they used to use during the Punic Wars. But it's a really cool idea. They really did their homework on what these ships are supposed to look like. It's just a really weird feature that they have their masts and sails still on. The decks are cleared for battle. They do not have their masts on them. Every ship in a naval battle in the ancient world moves on rowing power. There are no sailing warships. It doesn't happen. This is just like extra weight that destabilizes and slows down the ship.
I claim this city for the glory of Rome.
Historically, it doesn't make sense. Numidia had been subjected centuries earlier, but it's very interesting to see a city built on the sea. Like, the defenses go right up to the water. And you actually see in this scene, they have a double wall. So they have an outer curtain, which is right on the surf. And then they have these passages leading to an inner curtain as well. So there's a layered defense system going on, which is really, historically quite common for bigger cities. And it's really effective because, of course, it means if the enemy overcomes the first line, there's still a second line you can fight for. And you're pushing them into this narrow, confined space where they're going to be overlooked by your archers, overlooked by your warriors. You love to see it. And also, obviously, building your wall up to the shore, you can use the sea as an additional defense. It's the mother of all ditches. And then the catapults start throwing fireballs. And I'm like, Ridley, we talked about this. Catapults are always throwing fireballs in these movies. They historically didn't. They would never do that. Why would you do that? You're gonna set your own ships on fire. This is a terrible idea. You'd throw basic rocks or shoot bolts at the defenders to keep their heads down. That's all they're good for, really. Okay, stop. No. Was that a trebuchet? Yeah, that's a trebuchet. I mean, again, like maybe he had those left over from Kingdom of Heaven or something, or from one of his other movies, but like this is 1,000 years out of place. It's an invention of the medieval period. The Romans did not know counterweight trebuchets. Stop it. The Greeks invented torsion artillery, which is a very basic form of bolt shooter. They later developed stone shooters. The Romans elaborated on this. They developed these onagers, which are these armed catapults. They think no one would notice or that it wouldn't necessarily draw any attention. So a lot of the equipment here is basically just a mishmash of different ancient Mediterranean arms and armor. And then, for some reason, the hero, your Paul Mescal's character, he's just wearing the cloth weird little leather thing. They should have put him in one of the armors that at least have a historical reference to it. Like some of that mail in the background is really great. I just put him in that. Like that's functional. And then, of course, as soon as the fighting starts, or even before the fight, like the helmets come off so that you can see who's who, which is classic Hollywood stuff, but extremely unrealistic.
This is about survival! Survive!
Yeah, I don't think there is any evidence of someone riding a rhino in the ancient world. So he dies there, right? He survives somehow, he's fine, he just gets up, it's cool. But, like, he gets thrown by a rhino. I don't think you shake that off. Wild animals were often a feature of gladiatorial combat. Like, they would let wild animals into the arena and have the gladiators enact hunts, essentially. Just try to hunt them and kill them. The exoticism is part of the spectacle. So if you could get weirder animals that have been less often seen in Rome, that would be even better. There is evidence of rhinos making an appearance in the Flavian amphitheater, but we don't really know if they were ever made to fight humans. I mean, most of the time they would probably be put on display or made to fight other animals.
The Colosseum.
Gladiatorial naval combat called naumachia is a real thing. Most likely this would have happened in separate venues that were purpose-built to allow them to move the water in and out quickly, and where they'd have more space to kind of do this reenactment. I think it's really interesting they actually put that on the screen. There's absolutely no evidence that the Romans would ever bring sharks into play in these naval gladiatorial fights. This is not something that you can easily just sort of transport into the Flavian amphitheater. That's just not going to happen.
Into that judgment. Gods have spoken!
So the thumbs up, thumbs down thing, it's a big cliche for movies. We don't actually know the gestures that were used. So this is something that's become an icon of movies about ancient Rome, but it has very little to do with the actual evidence. I would probably give it a 5. There are some things that you really love to see this on the screen, like the naumachia, the naval assault of a city, like great stuff. But the way that he did it ends up being really kind of sloppy and messy, and with mistakes that didn't need to be made.
They attack before they can establish their war camp and supply their soldiers.
So I have many opinions, all of them bad. So they're supposed to have run from their camp into battle by running a mile across this plain. Now, many people question this for obvious reasons, and many people have questioned it for centuries. We don't really believe that people could run that far in full armor in the summer heat. And I think that's what they're kind of trying to convey, that the Persians were taken by surprise because the Athenians were advancing much faster and going straight into that fight. What I'm trying to convey is this idea that the Athenians won the Battle of Marathon through shock tactics. The Athenians didn't attack them while they were disembarking. They encamped across from them in this plain and sat looking at each other for 10 days. This is such a bizarre way of depicting Greek equipment. I mean, we know very well what kind of equipment they would have carried because they kept on depicting it on all of their art. And especially after this victory, they were very proud of depicting themselves the way they looked and depicting the Persians the way they had been defeated. They have little bossed shields, which are wrong. The swords are accurate. That sword that Themistocles is carrying looks like a very good Greek xiphos, but then they have double-headed axes. They have all sorts of random weapons that have absolutely no place in classical Greece. Greeks are heavy spearmen, double grip shields, long spears, heavy armor. The Persians seem to be carrying the khopesh, which is an Egyptian sword. The Egyptians were a big part of the Persian navy, so you might have had some Egyptian marines on board, may have carried these kinds of weapons. But I mean, if we assume that this is a force of Persians, which the movie wants you to believe, then why are they carrying Egyptian weapons and not Persian ones? So the ancient battle account actually does say that they pursued the Persians to their ships and they seized some of the ships. So they have these really broad gangplanks, which, I mean, would have been really nice if they had those. I think that would have make things a lot easier. But as far as we know, embarking and disembarking from these ships is actually quite difficult because they're just sort of either beached or lying just offshore. While this clip is working with sort of a kernel of what we're told about the Battle of Marathon, basically everything you're seeing here is complete fantasy, so I would give it a 2. One thing I'll give them, the kind of sheer scale of the violence happening in this battle, is something that the Greeks themselves were already kind of wanting to convey. Like, they want us to know that this is a huge thing. Right now! Right now! Okay, him slapping the lances with his sword, right? Not only is that not historical, like, that was made up by that guy right there for this scene. Like, he just thought that would be a cool thing to do, so he did it, and that they kept it in the movie. And, like, you know, it works so well that you almost want this to be a real thing. And people sometimes ask me, like, is that a real thing? Is that something that ancient or medieval commanders would do? It's like, no, Bernard Hill did that, and now it's in this, like, incredible depiction of something that looks like pre-modern warfare. But that's just cinema. That's just in this movie. So cavalry charges usually would have been a lot slower than you see in movies, where in movies they spend a lot of time galloping. They're kind of going in at full speed into the enemy, and they do that for a long time because it gives a sense of speed and drama, and it gets that nice hoofbeat sound. If they have to be tight, they have to be close together. And so in order to maintain that, you got to make sure that you don't go too fast too soon, because the horses will have different paces. So what they would actually do is they would approach slowly. Maybe they would break into a trot at some point. When they got near the enemy, they will break into a canter. But if they even gallop at all, that would only be like the last couple dozen meters. Some people will argue that the effect of a cavalry charge is purely psychological, so you'd never actually crash into a prepared enemy. You would always kind of be riding through an enemy that's already broken and running away. So you're kind of just slapping them in the back while they've already been driven off. But the other theory is actually that horses can be trained to crash into a solid object. This idea that you see in this scene of them throwing bodies, there's a testimony by, I think, Winston Churchill, actually, from Omdurman, where he describes this happening, that the infantry was literally just bodied by these horses, and that's what would happen when the cavalry slams into them. I think the movie is trying to signal this idea. It's like, we know that it's going to be very difficult. You know, we know not everyone believes that cavalry can charge into a prepared position and carry it. So we're kind of trying to anticipate that by saying, look, these orcs were already wavering. And so when they start wavering and opening up gaps and lifting their weapons, that's when cavalry has the opportunity to overrun them. I mean, Oliphants are basically just a sort of souped up fantasy version of the war elephant. In ancient times, when they were first introduced, they were very effective because any army that hadn't seen these animals before was going to be absolutely terrified. So what you often see infantry do when elephants charge them is just make space, just make canals, make pathways through the formation, just get out of the way. And the elephants will prefer not to be fighting you and rather just be running on. That's what the Romans eventually figured out they should do against Carthaginian elephants, for instance. In this case, I think they're too close together, so it's going to be really difficult to create those channels. The other option is essentially to overwhelm them with missiles, using light infantry, using archers and other kind of skirmishers to try and build a screen against elephants is usually very effective. He's throwing his lance at the rider who's controlling the Oliphant. which is, I mean, I guess it's a way to try and disable them. But the problem that you're facing really isn't the fact that there's a driver controlling the elephant. The problem is that you've got an elephant coming at you. And so really what you want to do is get that animal to either move past you harmlessly or turn away. In terms of cinema, in terms of emotion, this is the best scene. Like, this is the best kind of ancient warfare scene that you could possibly imagine. Return of the King is always going to be awesome out of 10. If you wanted me to put a number on this, it's very difficult to say because it's fantasy, but like, I'd probably give it an 8. This scene is portraying the siege of Kerak. The Muslim army, they would often try to isolate Crusader knights, trying to get around them and then sort of encircle them, attack them from all sides. That seems to be fairly accurate. But at the same time, I mean, they would do that in conjunction with horse archers and other missile troops that they would use to try and soften that formation up first. There should absolutely be arrows flying everywhere, and most of these Frankish knights would probably be dead before they even make it to combat. It's also especially weird to see that the Frankish knights decide to split up. I mean, that's absolute madness. I mean, that's guaranteeing your own defeat. They should have stuck together as close as they could. They should have made a strong column and driven it straight into the Muslim force. That's the only chance they have of getting out alive. The cavalry tactics of medieval heavy cavalry, like medieval European cavalry, are very much based on the idea that they are a heavy shock force. They're meant to trample the enemy. I feel like that Ridley Scott clearly put a lot of effort into training his horsemen to allow him to do this kind of maneuvering, and he wanted to show it on screen. It looks great, but tactically, it's nonsense. Like, they would never have fought like this, and it has absolutely no chance of achieving anything. The advantage of a lance is that it can be couched when you're charging, when you're using it on horseback. So you can actually put that lance somewhere under your arm where it's stable, where it's braced by the rest of your body and by the horse, so that you can then maintain a direct line into combat and put the full weight of your horse and your person and your weapon behind that point. I think he should have been overhand, like that gives you the range. I would give it a 4. This scene is a nonsense, but the movie tells the story right. Normally in battles like these, when Roman infantry is fighting, you'd want to see them use their throwing spears, which they had to kind of disrupt enemy formations. And so in theory, you should want to see these two lines exchanging these volleys of javelins before they actually get into hand-to-hand combat. But we're told that, specifically at Philippi, they didn't do this. It was really quite a battle of butchers, essentially. They went straight into close combat and just hacked at each other with swords until there was no one left standing. You see them marching into battle in these orderly blocks, in these orderly units. That is very much how a Roman legion would advance. The problem with the scene is that, like, on the surface, that looks great and I'm happy with it, but then it's suddenly devolved into this Hollywood mob brawl. That is not a realistic battlefield. Those units would try to maintain their formation as long as possible, and if you lose your formation, you run away, you instantly break, you get the hell out of there because you want to restore order before you fight. And the other thing that they do that really annoys me, these guys who are squeezing their way to the back and then the next rank comes forward and they're literally holding onto the straps on each other's equipment to try and make sure that that formation maintains that same order and that the guys are all sort of slotting in where they're supposed to be. This is a really unhistorical way to depict what a Roman army would actually do, which is not rank rotation, but line rotations. What these Roman armies were equipped to do was to take the entire unit, including its front rank and all the other ranks, out of the line and replace it with another unit that was coming up from behind. They would have a line rotation system, usually in 3 lines, that would take turns bearing the brunt of the fighting. But within those lines, within those units, the front rank had to remain the front rank. It was absolutely instrumental to the functioning of an ancient infantry formation. I hold a grudge against them for using that stupid whistle. It bothers me. So I'm going to have to mark them down for it. But the equipment in this show is really the best that you've seen Romans. Like this is really quite authentic for the late Republic. The mail armor, the simple helmets, the big shields that they're carrying. So I guess I'd give it a 5. It's a common tactic is to try and find one position that they're not paying attention to or that hasn't been reinforced to the same degree sneaking in there with a small force. Alexander the Great did it a few times. He would just offer rewards for the first person to make it up a particularly difficult slope or something like that, in order to overcome the defenses of a particularly strong position. I have no idea how you would be able to shoot a bolt with a crossbow that would dig so deep into a stone wall that you could hang a man from it. That seems wild. I'm very impressed with that crossbow. I want that technology. I'm surprised they haven't used a ladder to climb the wall instead of doing this sort of really elaborate thing. By far the most common way for cities to fall was through treachery. So you'd almost always either have someone sneak in and open the gates, or you'd have someone on the inside open the gates for you. When you read ancient treatises like Aeneas Tacticus, the vast bulk of that work is devoted to how do you keep people from giving away the password, sewing through the crossbar of the gate. How do you keep people from sending signals to people outside, the besieging force? So that kind of factor is much more important in the defense of an ancient city than the technicalities of what kind of weapons you might use to defend it, at least in the minds of ancient authors. Give it a 6. He's infiltrating the wall in a really bizarre way. That doesn't make sense. But then fundamentally the idea of opening up a gate from the inside so that friendly forces can approach the city and enter, that's obviously very realistic. This scene depicts the siege of Sanyang. You also see this arms race between attackers and defenders in terms of siege equipment that they're trying to use. The Mongols tried to bring up their original trebuchets, which are essentially man-powered, which have a limited range, to try and bring down the walls. Song defenders realized that this would make the defense a short story, so they dug a moat that was wide enough that it was impossible to push those trebuchets close enough to the wall to actually do any damage. As always, the ditch is not there, so you can't actually see that in the show.
More counterweight, Talib.
Any more weight, the axle? More counterweight.
Why are they on fire? Why? Marco Polo tells us that he participated in this siege and that he actually explained the use of counterweight catapults or counterweight trebuchets to the Mongols. But he seems to be inflating his own role in that. It was these Iraqi Muslim engineers that showed them how to build a counterweight catapult, or counterweight trebuchet, which works on the power of gravity with a very large counterweight in order to swing the beam around a fulcrum and throw an object a far greater distance than older forms of siege artillery. What they're arguing here, that you need to put on more weight to increase the range, that's exactly right. I mean, that is how they work fundamentally. You just need to have engineered a structure that can take the power of that sudden swing without losing control of the beam and the missile. Why would you do that? The Mongols had a real problem when they were engaging fortified positions, which is that they specialized in mounted warfare. They could defeat anyone in the open. They had the arms to do that, but they struggled with, siege assaults where you need a lot of infantry to overcome fortifications. But in this particular fight scene, you're actually seeing Song soldiers outside of the walls. They're caught in the open. So this is where the Mongol advantage would come into effect. They should absolutely remain on horseback and fight them on horseback, because at that point, scattered infantry is absolutely, unable to defend itself. These are some of the earliest gunpowder weapons in existence. At this point, they don't really exist yet in Europe. But they really are just this. They're essentially a tube on a stick. So they look quite bulky and it's difficult to hold them, and you kind of need a second person to show up and actually ignite the fuse. I would give this a 3. The Battle of the Siege of Sanyang is a really important moment in history, and so it's nice that there is some depiction of that.
Hi, I'm Dr. Michael Fulton. I'm an expert at siege warfare and medieval fortifications. There's nothing far-fetched about sneaking into a castle or town. There are ways to do that, whether you're disguised as somebody or you're hiding in something. Kind of runs to the edge and says, "Hey, you, stop that." There's a traditional phenomenon called castle watch. You're really just watching, making sure that nobody sneaks up on your castle. What you're trying to defend your castle against is a large army, because it's very hard to take a castle unless you have a large army. It's hard to sneak up on a castle. If you're coming with an army, people know that army is coming. I think this is supposed to be Kildrummy Castle, which by this point had a very elaborate gate system. So just opening that gate would have been quite a challenge. Everybody's going to go to that gate. A gate like that would have been a whole structure. So each gate to that structure would presumably have been locked by someone on the inside. The idea of this small party trying to rush against this small group that are in the Great Hall, I kind of don't understand, because a castle of this scale is going to have a lot more defenders, and you're going to have to overcome them all. So your priority is really seizing the strategic parts of the castle. The Great Hall is not really one of them. Sleeping on the floor of the Great Hall was a traditional thing to do. It's starting to go out of fashion by this point in history. But if you were to look back at, say, the 11th, 12th century, the king's retainers or the lord's retainers, his kind of high-ranking guys would have a lot of drinking parties and then just kind of pass out on the floor around. There would be weapons around. You wouldn't need to necessarily don your armor in order to defend a castle like this. That's much more helpful in an open battle. Maybe a 2 if I'm being generous.
Hey, Archer! Stay alive!
The little screens there, those were very important because they just stopped arrows. The moat or the ditch, this is the most basic fortification element other than some kind of a basic wall. This was supposed to be the castle at Chalon. It's up on a hill, so I'm not sure if it would have needed a ditch, but if it looked at all like this, where the ground is kind of nice and approachable leading up, you're absolutely going to have a ditch, because it's so easy. They put a lot of effort in hanging these incendiaries on the gate. Why don't you just put it at the bottom of the gate? Setting gates on fire is a legitimate tactic here. It largely predates this period, though. If you have incendiaries during this period, they are more likely to look like tar than like, well, presumably like gasoline, because you have to refine it. The portcullis has disappeared for some reason. So the portcullis design like that, where it's that lattice structure, that was coming into fashion around this time. Whether it is wood that has been kind of coated with metal or plated, or whether it's entirely metal, you see both variations. The whole point of it, though, is that it is open, so you can stick stuff through it if you want. And if it's metal, presumably it means you can't set it on fire, which is critical here, right? Traditionally, the gate is the weakest part of a fortified enclosure because it's a hole, right? So you need to strengthen that hole to make sure that it's not a point of weakness or vulnerability. So through the 13th century, gates actually become the strongest part of a castle instead of the weakest part, just because of the level of development that goes into it. Kind of walking up to a gate, trying to set it on fire, trying to use a ram against it. They've had a long time to think about these kind of siege tactics and to develop fortifications accordingly. So it's kind of anachronistic, or the siege tactics are already a little bit outdated in this representation. These guys are trying. They haven't pulled it all together as best as they could. I'd give them somewhere 5, 6. These are terrible catapults. The stones seem to somehow speed up as they leave the basket. Should slow down from that point. If you look at how big this chunk of stone is, it's significantly larger than the engine that's supposed to be throwing it. Now, throwing heads is a real thing. This is an element of psychological warfare. It's definitely an intimidation tactic. When the First Crusade reached Nicaea in 1097, both the attackers and defenders threw heads at each other. It took place more often when you had groups facing off from different cultures. You don't put a trebuchet, a big counterweight style trebuchet, on top of a tower for a few reasons. It is heavy, so the tower actually has to be able to support the weight of the engine. You get a little bit more range, but that horizontal range is actually less than the vertical height that you've elevated the engine. If you put it on the ground behind the tower, all of a sudden you don't have to worry about supporting this engine and all its stresses, and you actually get the shielding of the wall in front to protect it from the enemy's machines, who are presumably trying to break it up. There is this desire or need to make them really big and really impressive. So these were important weapons, but nowhere near as exciting as Hollywood loves to make them out to be. To attack a big curved wall is just like attacking any other wall. Rounded towers are designed purposely to deflect incoming artillery and such. Cohesively, a rounded tower is stronger because it doesn't have corners, so you don't have the same kind of points of stress. So if you're trying to undermine a tower, a round tower is slightly stronger than a square one. Cities built on cliffs that you'd attack. Why don't you just build on top of the cliff? As real as an orc siege of a make-believe city can be, I'm still going to have to give this 1 out of 10. Night attacks can take place. There's nothing to say that they didn't or that they shouldn't. Are they trying to go through a gate? There are 3 ways to overcome a wall. You can go over it, in which case you use ladders, siege towers, stuff like that. You can go under it, which is not a great strategy because then you can emerging on the other side one by one if you tunnel under. Or you can go through. And the best way to go through is actually to undermine the wall. Dig a big cavity underneath the wall, you prop up the wall above with wooden posts, you throw a bunch of combustibles in, all that support gets burnt out, the wall above falls down. Lighting arrows on fire like this, Hollywood loves to do it, serves no practical value unless you're trying to set a thatched roof cottage on fire. So they've kind of got up to the base of the wall here. This is a safe spot in so much as it's hard for archers to shoot arrows at them from here, but you can just drop some stones over on them. It's economical. If you consider that every arrow has to be made by hand, that's not a short process to make an arrow. So when they're throwing off all these volleys of arrows and shooting them off as fast as they can, that's not very efficient. You drop a bowling ball on somebody and it stops them in their tracks.
Any man dies with a clean sword, oh my God!
Defenders exit a gate and try and attack the besiegers. That's reasonably common. The issue here is why. You would only do this if you needed to. Those attackers didn't have the numbers they probably needed to overcome these defenses to begin with. In the medieval period, leadership is directly tied to military performance and prowess. So for a commander, they have to be aware of what's going on if they are kind of a warrior figure, which the most effective military kings usually were. So having someone on top of the wall, organizing things, definitely not beyond the realm of possibility. I don't quite see what they're going to accomplish once they reach the base of this wall. So I'm going to give this one maybe a 3 out of 10. This is the Siege of Rochester, 1215. Do whatever you can to help your side get through, because if you're then left alone on that wall, you're going to be killed yourself. So the very worst thing you can do is get to the top of the wall and then be left alone.
This way.
Rarely you find women actually taking a direct role in the fighting, but you do find relatively frequent examples of women will bring weapons and supplies to people fighting. They bring particularly water and food. So there's absolutely a role for these kind of people to play. The church is a very logical place for them to be if they're not taking part in the fighting. At this time, the importance or the centrality of God in a conflict like this would have been huge.
They were too cold to fight and too hungry.
Sieges would last anywhere from kind of weeks to months. When an army moves into enemy territory, if there are crops, it will destroy them. For those inside the defensive perimeter, they're forced to make do with the food that they have. Very rarely did strongholds actually fall by force. The outer line of defenses might fall, but then those that are still in the innermost part will surrender. If the attackers are not able to impose a complete blockade, there might be actually supplies coming in to support the defenders throughout the siege. You get this in, particularly when you're talking about bigger cities being attacked. I've got to give them a 4 or 5 out of 10. This is not what Paris looked like at the time. The big church in the background, this is high Gothic. The palace right next to it, this looks suspiciously like the Papal Palace in Avignon, which is 14th century, not 9th century. Certainly love using the crossbows. There's anecdotal evidence here that they were kind of introduced to the Franks at this point. So you've got guys kind of leaning through the crenelles like this, which are the spaces between the merlins, the teeth on the walls. And at what point they came into use, these would have been around at this point. So penthouses like these that they're using for shelter are very important. This is a safe way to kind of get to the base of the walls of a city. Usually what you'd use these for, particularly in later periods, is undermining the city walls. So it's a means of getting up to the city walls and then trying to dig a hole under them. How strong is this gate? Because really these are just some planks. Horses are important. The significance of mounted warriors is really growing throughout this period. In a siege, though, horses tend not to be terribly useful. Eating, they need to be fed. They produce waste, which needs to be dealt with. So siege towers are an important siege weapon in warfare. They are a great way to get people into an elevated position. The primary function of a siege tower really is to elevate attackers, as opposed to trying to get them to the top of a wall. That might be a handy secondary purpose, hiding behind their parapet. So here, it's very helpful, but a ladder would be a much cheaper and cost-effective manner to get up to the top. So I would rate this somewhere around, I don't know, a 3 or a 4. And the siege technologies aren't exactly that accurate. It wouldn't be uncommon to have castle gates open if you were just guarding this gate against any kind of troublemakers. It's very believable that the guards would be down on the bottom floor. It's a lot easier to chase somebody down if you're already down there. For him to go around killing people indiscriminately, that actually makes sense. Once someone gets into the fortified enclosure, there's no protection for those within unless some kind of peace agreement is prearranged. So the whole point of a castle is you're having walls do the work of defenders. The whole market kind of environment would usually be outside the castle. The environment inside the castle is catering only to those really who live there or might need to take refuge there. It was a matter of protecting who was in charge. You don't often find cases where someone is lauded for single-handedly capturing a castle or some other fortification. More often, you will find individuals praised for their conduct. The first person to set foot on a defender's wall, so if you're the first one up on your ladder, the first one up on your siege tower, usually that person gets special mention. To take a castle, kind of like we associate them or we picture them, you're going to need a force in at least the hundreds, probably the thousands. I have no idea what to offer this one. I believe this is a real castle. It's setting about a very kind of rose-colored glasses day in the life of a castle. It's trying, I don't know. Just lobbing arrows at a distance is not an effective siege tactic or counter siege tactic. So when you see archers, they pull an arrow, they knock it, they draw, and then they kind of hold, then they shoot their arrows all at once. This is inspired by later musket tactics, where you have lines of musketeers shooting off volleys. For the same reason that you would wait until the attackers got closer to shoot a musket at them. Well, a ladder is just propped up against a wall. They'd actually be quite sturdy, and you'd reuse them sometimes. So this would have been a difficult tactic, but a believable one. So the easiest way to try and make sure that ladder doesn't get used is either to break the ladder somehow, which is kind of hard given the angles involved, or to take a long stick and just try and push the ladder to the point where it goes past the vertical and falls over backwards. So that's very believable. So you do have certain accounts of machines like these that will in some way hold something not friendly over the walls and then drop it on the attackers. Usually they're deployed against a siege tower or something a little bit more impressive, because if it's just guys coming up a ladder, you just drop some stones on them. You often find them in kind of, or being associated with sailors. You effectively have a mast and then a yard of some description, and it will then be swung out over the wall, and using rigging that sailors would be accustomed to, they can then drop something on the attackers. The descriptions of these vary. Sometimes it's kind of a ring that's on fire. Other times it's something really heavy. Other times you have just a log with spikes kind of being hoisted or tossed over the wall. I'm not an expert of East Asian warfare, but there's some good elements to this. There's also, the obvious fantasy aspect to it. So I don't know, maybe 4 out of 10.
My name is Michael Taylor. I'm an associate professor of history at the University at Albany. I am an expert in ancient military history, particularly focused on the military history of the Roman Republic and the Roman army.
The Roman triremes.
So we have here a time travel scenario where Indiana Jones has been transported back to the siege of Syracuse in 212 BC, a plane flying over this siege where the Romans are trying to capture the Greek city of Syracuse during the Second Punic War. One thing that Indy gets wrong is Harrison Ford calls these ships triremes. At this point, the Romans are almost certainly deploying quinqueremes. The bigger ship has more rowers, more power, and as a result, more deck space, since you can actually put bigger catapults. So if you're doing a naval siege, which is an aspect of the siege of Syracuse, you're going to want quinqueremes. The sort of giant bolts penetrating the plane, that's not necessarily unrealistic. I would be very surprised if any Roman catapult or ballista could range as far as they're shown in that scene, trying to, shooting a plane out of the air. So famously, the Syracusan defense in the siege of Syracuse was overseen by Archimedes, the scientist and engineer. He also has set up or rigged up a series of cranes, and some of these cranes have a chain and a grappling hook. Archimedes' cranes are supposedly quite effective at swinging around, getting this grappling hook at the end of the chain onto a ship, and in some instances, capsizing the ship. That story, of course, also over time improved into the telling, including the fanciful notion that he rigged up a series of mirrors or reflective shields to set Roman ships on fire. That seems to be physically impossible. The whole scene is fanciful and doesn't strike me as terribly historical, so I give it a 3. A sling can actually be reasonably effective. You certainly can absolutely kill someone. The one downside is a shield or a shield wall, as those soldiers are making, is very likely going to repel those slings. So slings are used for skirmishing, but if you have a really disciplined infantry formation, you're not going to be able to break it apart just with slings and arrows. We do have at least one instance of one line throwing it followed by another line followed by another, so a kind of rolling volley. That is attested in our sources. In Hollywood films, they very rarely show the Romans hurling their javelins. Every Roman legionary carries 2 heavy javelins. They're called singular pilum, plural pila, and they are very, very lethal weapons. They have a long iron shank that goes through an enemy's shield. It keeps going to what's ever behind that shield. So a pilum volley is a really devastating event. Here they're fighting light infantry, but it's actually a way to even the odds when you're facing a lot of missile troops. You have things you can throw to make them run away. A testudo formation is just a very close, compact formation where not only are the shields in the front of the formation locked together, but the soldiers in the rear ranks lift their shields over their heads. The soldiers on their sides hold their shields to the sides, and basically it creates a kind of box-like formation protecting the soldiers as they move forward. It is primarily attested in sieges. The guys actually walking up on the testudo is also something that we hear of. It's a way of getting guys over a low wall, and is something that is even practiced in the amphitheater sometimes as a kind of show of military agility. I'm going to give it an 8. I liked an attempt to show how tactics might work. They again form a testudo there. But they don't need to. You form a testudo if there's some kind of overhead threat of missile weapons. There it seemed that actually might be a disadvantageous formation because as they kind of show, if you're in that dense formation and guys are coming at you, it's hard for you to use your own weapons against them. If I were a halfway sensible British warrior, I wouldn't jump on top of a Roman shield because I know that there's a gladius coming right behind it.
Close the circle! Close the circle! Tighten the circle!
So we do hear of a formation that you use when you are, unfortunately, like these Romans, surrounded by enemy, and it's called an orbis, basically a circle, as a formation that you use if you need to form a perimeter on all sides. So whether or not it looked exactly like that, obviously we can't say, but that is actually a real formation. When we hear of chariots getting taken out, the advice is send someone with a missile weapon, an archer or a slinger, or in this instance a guy with a pilum, and kill the driver. And then that disables the chariot. That's probably one reason why chariots do go away is it is easy to kind of, you kill one guy and then the whole system is sort of broken, whereas with the cavalrymen, you might kill one cavalryman, but there's others on those horses. Overall, this clip I think is pretty good. I'd be tempted to give it a 9. This sort of giant stone-throwing catapults, what the Romans might call an onager, because it kicks like a wild donkey, called an onager. These huge catapults would probably not be deployed in a field battle. The Romans might use catapults like that. You would use them in a siege scenario, because when you're fighting a battle, you want artillery that you can really easily reposition as your forces move across the battlefield. So the Romans do have field artillery that is tactical, can be used in a battle, but it's smaller. It can be carried on a cart. Flaming arrows might be used again in a siege scenario if you want to shoot them to light the roof of a tower on fire or light buildings, say behind a wall on fire. They don't do you any good in a pitched battle. If you hit a guy with an arrow, his problem is that he has an arrow sticking out of it, not that the shaft is on fire. Hollywood needs light, and flaming arrows provide that for the kind of spectacle of the scene. If you plan to advance over a battlefield, you don't necessarily want to set it on fire before your own forces move into it. In terms of what incendiary devices are available to the Romans, they have things like just putting charcoal in a pot, and then those burning embers sort of pop out when the pot breaks upon impact. They do seem to use a variety of petroleum products that might burn. One thing I would note, Incendiary devices get really good in the Middle Ages, and the secret ingredient there is gunpowder. They don't have that in the ancient world, so all of their incendiary devices are a bit subpar. One thing that is inauthentic is Maximus leading the charge himself. Roman generals almost never charge with the cavalry. They tend to position themselves right in the center of the battle where they can kind of control things and have the maximum situational awareness. So for Maximus to charge with the cavalry, note that he loses his ability to command the battle. He's out there wrestling with a German, and it's his subordinate who's in the center with the infantry who's actually in the best position to actually exert any kind of command and control over that situation. Roman generals like to stay in the middle, and they usually stay with the infantry, in part also because the infantry tends to be the decisive point in Roman battle. The Romans basically do not use chariots in any kind of tactical way, aside from the ceremonial chariot, so there would have been no Scythe chariots. I would say that is a decent formation, but if you're under any kind of cavalry attack or chariot attack, it seems one of the best things you can do is present a relatively dense massed formation that prevents any one or two people from getting picked off. I'd say I'd be inclined to give it around a 7. This is a very rare clip that actually attempts to show a legion maneuvering over a battlefield. In the triplex acies, the threefold battle lines that the Romans have, where their cohorts, their individual units, are arrayed in this kind of checkerboard formation. So the Romans don't like to form a single dense massed formation. Because that single dense massed formation can be brittle, it can be broken up by an obstacle. If it gets disordered, everything gets disordered. Each cohort fights somewhat independently of the other cohorts, and that actually gives the overall legion a lot of tactical flexibility on the battlefield. If I'm the Romans in the front rank and I see these guys rolling the fire logs, I'm just going to kill the guys rolling the fire logs, and then the problem is solved. Also, my guess is those logs are kept on fire because they've put a lot of gasoline on them. The ancients are not going to have any kind of incendiary materials as effective, which means probably the logs are just going to burn out as they're rolled forward. So the swords approximate the Roman gladius that is in use at this time. And one thing that is inauthentic is you do not use a gladius to sort of fence with the way they're fencing in this clip. But a gladius is always used with a scutum. The sword is too short and chunky to effectively parry with. Essentially, if you were confronting an opponent, you absorb and parry his blows with your scutum, and then you strike with your gladius. It's the scutum and the gladius are together a kind of weapon system. I would give this a 7. The classic legion moving across the field, I've got to say I've got a soft spot for it. Once everything degenerates into the scrum, it gets a lot worse. Chariot racing is particularly popular throughout the Roman Empire as a centerpiece of games that are put on. It's a dangerous profession. Maybe not quite as dangerous as being a gladiator, but it certainly is a very hazardous performance that you're putting on. Charioteers sometimes wear safety gear, but it's padded. It's specifically designed for what happens if I fall off this horse. We do know that they would carry some kind of knife to cut the reins. They could kind of bail out of their chariot before things truly spun out of control. Piracy at this point exists, but no pirate is going to be in a position to have a huge fleet and engage in a fleet-style action against the Roman Navy. These guys are going to be probably much more similar to the kind of Somali pirates that we've seen in the Red Sea. Fishermen who with boats or people who are sometimes merchants, sometimes raiders, but not with the military capacity of even trying to engage any kind of Roman force.
Ramming speed!
Yes, it's great to break their oars, but it's even better if you can just get your ram in the hull of their ship, and then that sinks it. We absolutely know that ships are sunk because of ramming. They found off the coast of Sicily a series of rams left over from a naval battle between the Romans and the Carthaginians. And where every ram is picked up off the seafloor, that's where a ship got rammed, sank to the bottom, the timbers rotted away, and now there's a ram on the floor of the Mediterranean. As much as the chariot scene is classic, the naval battle is just awful. So I'm going to say 5. So this is based on the Battle of the Teutoburger Wald. This took place in 9 AD and was an ambush by a Germanic confederacy of 3 Roman legions that were moving through the Teutoburg forest. It's one of the heaviest losses that the Romans suffer during the imperial period. 3 legions wiped out over the course of 3 days.
And this is the Roman army amid our forests and swamps.
So the Romans don't necessarily typically march in a huge square. Varus and his soldiers are vulnerable simply because they're moving over narrow, more poorly developed roads in a forest. That's going to require them a relatively long snaking column, which those 3 legions were supposedly, yes, drawn out into. Soldiers fighting back to back here certainly would not be ideal. It's something you only do if you're caught sort of unprepared in an ambush. And the kind of formation that you might want to break into if there's Germans on all sides might be something like an orbis formation or some kind of square perimeter. I'm going to give it an 8. The military equipment actually looks quite good. Lorica segmentata armor is actually first attested at this battlefield. It's the first time we've recovered it archaeologically. It's that kind of cool face mask we see the officer wearing also reflects a find that we found at the Calcresi site. I am not aware of any whistles being used. We certainly know that trumpets are used to, usually at a grander level, to signal troops to move in a certain way. Here probably the centurion's most effective sort of equipment is just going to be his own voice. Centurions are, I think, to use the cliche, they're the backbone of the Roman army. They are a very important officer in the Roman army. There's 60 centurions in each legion, and that means there's actually a lot of people who can control troops at a kind of very local level. So even if the general doesn't know what's going on, centurions can make decisions. Now, we do know that Caesar's army, which, like the army in Spartacus, usually fights in 3 lines. And one reason for doing that is if the people in the front line become exhausted, you can bring up cohorts from the rear ranks to replace them. Now, that being said, we do not have evidence of any kind of extremely coordinated system of rotating men within an individual century or cohort. That's something they've kind of made up. What the system that they show honestly seems clumsy and impractical to me. You don't want that many men cycling around a formation when you're trying to maintain its coherence and like the Gauls are rushing against you. We also do have a textual passage which describes a battle fought shortly after Caesar's death as part of the Roman Civil War that simply says men stayed in the front rank until they were killed and then they were replaced. So that probably is the simplest way to do it.
Get back in formation, you drunken fool!
Pullo and Varenus are based on actual centurions in Caesar's army who fight valiantly for Caesar in Gaul. Pullo in this series just portrayed as this total screw-up. The actual historical Pullo is a very, very effective centurion, just like Varenus, and is a professional military man. Some things that I like include the fact that all of the Roman soldiers are wearing mail armor. That is authentic. I do like the idea of Roman soldiers fighting in coherent formations. I'm going to give it an 8. The Romans are employing a type of heavily armored cavalry called Klebenarii or cataphracti. These are developed in the East. They're initially developed probably in Iran. But the Romans learn of their effectiveness and copy them. These are actually kind of the forerunners of in some ways, medieval knights. Most of these units are still in the East, but it's not impossible that you would have cataphracts fighting in the late Roman West with both heavy armor for the rider, heavy armor for the horses, and using a lance as kind of the primary weapon. Horse archers in general can be extremely accurate. The most accurate horse archers are going to be those who are raised usually on a kind of steppe or plains environment and kind of grow up doing horse archery. That's where the Romans will try to recruit their horse archers if they can. They can actually shoot, time their shot for when in between the horse's hooves hitting the ground, so they actually have a pause to take an accurate shot before the pump. This film imagines that Arthur is a late Roman commander, and he's given the same name as a historical Lucius Artorius Castus. He spent part of his career in Britain. He probably lived in either the 2nd or the 3rd century AD. Many hundreds of years before this film is set, I'm going to have to give it a 1. The simple fact that there are Romans in Britain in the 5th century is itself probably the most ridiculous thing.
Octavian's ships are so much faster than our Egyptian tubs.
The Battle of Actium is the last great battle of the Civil War between Octavian, the adopted son of Julius Caesar, and Mark Antony, who had been one of Caesar's most loyal lieutenants. They soon come to blows, and at the Battle of Actium, Octavian beats Mark Antony. Mark Antony is allied with Cleopatra. Cleopatra has inherited the Ptolemaic fleet, and the Ptolemies have traditionally had a fleet of very, very heavy warships. That's actually one of the more accurate things they say in the film. Those ships are primarily designed, it seems, to do naval sieges, kind of like the siege of Syracuse we saw, where you want big ships that can have a lot of artillery pieces. This is one of the rare naval battles where it does seem that incendiary devices are useful, possibly because the smaller ships that Octavian are using, they're not going to be able to necessarily effectively ram all of Antony's big ships. Throwing javelins is not going to stop you from getting rammed. Now, it may prevent you from getting boarded. That could be a consideration of if you think that ship is coming alongside you to board you, you're going to want to try to kill as many soldiers on the deck of the enemy ship to prevent a boarding. Ironically, the one advantage of doing that is if they've successfully rammed you and your ship is stricken, you might try to get onto their boat and board them. There are some rams that are fitted above the waterline as kind of secondary rams, and those do tend to be a bit narrower. It seems the idea is to cause kind of secondary damage compared to the main ram. The sort of big pointy pencil-like rams above water, not super accurate, although again we do have some narrower above water rams. You don't do that with the Gladius. If you're boarding an enemy ship, you're going to have your scutum, and it's going to be messy and nasty and slippery and difficult. But you're gonna fight as best you can, protecting yourself with your shield, striking with your sword. I think this scene is just overall terrible. I'm going to give it a 2.
I'm Dr. William Short. I'm an independent scholar focusing on scientific research of Vikings, particularly Viking combat. What he does is he catches a spear that was thrown at him, turns it around and throws it right back. And that is mentioned numerous times in the literary sources as being a very effective battle technique. And we've tested it, and it works great. It's really not so difficult to catch the spear in flight and throw it back. The nature of berserkers are still a little bit mysterious, but they are people who enter a battle frenzy before a battle, and the sources say they howl like wolves, They bite their shields, and iron and fire cannot harm them. So Vikings didn't use stone castles or anything like that. A typical enclosure would be a wood palisade fence. And climbing it with an axe seems very doable, using the axe to pull yourself up. And we've done a lot of research on the physics of these weapons, doing motion capture, measuring historic weapons, using computer models to study it. And what the axe has over some of the other weapons is just this insane amount of power. In one of our measurements, at the moment the two-handed axe hits the target, it just destroys what it touches. And that's how Vikings used it. So the weapon that Amleth is using in this clip once he enters the village is a sax. And before he enters, you can see that it's slung horizontally from his belt. A sax was a short sword. What the sax is a chopping weapon, and he's holding it upside down in a strange way and uses it for a slice, and that's not what the weapon is meant for at all. And destroying things with fire was just a way to emphasize the terror of these kinds of raids. We've done some tests where we actually built Viking houses, instrumented them, burned them down. It's only a matter of a few minutes before everyone inside is dead. The game, Knotlaker, a little bit off. We play it almost every year. Our research suggests that it's something quite different than what you see on the screen. So in the clip we see 5 versus 5, but in Viking times it's pretty clear that it was one-on-one. People were carefully matched to be about the same strength. You see a lot of running in this clip. The sources suggest running was not a part of the game at all. The game was really about power. It wasn't about speed. In the sources, when people talk about the games, they don't say that this team won or this team won. It's always this particular individual was stronger than his opponent. This one was stronger than this one. I give the creative team that made this film a lot of credit for doing deep research and really getting things right about Viking culture and Viking society. I would rate this as a 9. There are some things a little off, but there are so many things that are just perfect that I can't give it any less. This kind of sneaking up on the castle, probably not. Vikings were pretty direct about what they did. Now, they did use ambushes quite a bit. That was a very standard battle technique, but it was very different. What you do is get intelligence about where your enemy was going to be and when, and you'd go there and wait for them with a superior force. It's not like you jump out of the bushes or sneak up on them. You just wait, and when they arrive, you start fighting. The shield wall we see in this clip and numerous others really do not depict the shield wall as it was used in the Viking Age. The shield wall, the ancient word is skjaldborg, was mainly meant to protect against projectiles so that the king could observe and issue his orders, and then it would be taken down and continue the fight. The shield wall was meant to be a defensive structure thrown up temporarily, then taken down again. So having archers behind the shield wall, probably not so likely. Having archers further back from the front of the lines, definitely. That was very much a thing. So what they're using here is some sort of boom chain, something stretched across the river that's underwater until the last moment and can be pulled up to stop the ship at the appropriate moment. Now, even in Viking lands, these kinds of underwater obstacles were used, especially around trading towns, and try to minimize the possibility that raiders might attack the trading towns, because trading towns were very desirable targets for raiders. A lot of wealth. So chains, underwater obstacles such as posts and booms that were held below the water's surface, all of these were used. They're lifting their ships over the mountains and dropping them on the other side so they could sail to Paris. That's not a Viking approach at all. That's way off. They just sailed up the river. Viking ships were the technological marvel of their age that Vikings had and other European lands did not have. And one of the advantages of their ships is they were very shallow draft. They didn't need much water to float the ship. And so sailing up the river to Paris was no problem for them. Now, we know that Vikings did portage their ships, especially in the river systems of Eastern Europe, when they sailed on trading voyages from the Baltic Sea down to the Black Sea. It seems likely that the way they would portage a ship over land is with wooden rollers, just dragging it, probably mostly by human power, maybe with horses. I think I would rate this 4. The Vikings TV show uses historical people, names of people, historical places, but a lot of the details seem to transpire in this what-if fantasy world where people with Viking names have been dropped into something that's not very Viking. If we believe the myths, that battle would be over in about a half second. Loki was scared to death of Thor because he knew Thor would pulverize him. So in the instances where Thor issued a challenge, Loki quickly backed off. Yeah, so the Warhammer would not have been a thing in the Viking Age, except, of course, for Thor's Mjolnir, his special hammer. Numerous mentions of him smashing the skulls of his enemies with it, numerous mentions of him throwing it. But it had additional magical properties. It could bring the dead back to life. Now, in the world of humans, these kind of warhammers don't appear until way after the end of the Viking Age, late medieval and Renaissance, in a response to warriors starting to use plate armor for their defense. So they use these long, long warhammers to try to smash through the armor. I would give this a 3. The name is right. A few of the aspects are right, but most of it is kind of far off based on what we know of Thor, Loki. The axe had a very specific purpose in battle. This is a replica, and what it's intended to do is to split in two whatever it touches. What the sword has over the axe, the sword has maneuverability. You can change its trajectory as you're targeting. So if one target changes or becomes unavailable as the sword is in motion, you can retarget it and hit something else. With a two-handed axe, you can't do that. Once you set it in motion, it's going to hit. And the analogy we like to use is a sword is like a nuclear-tipped guided missile. You know that it's going to destroy what it hits, but you can retarget it after it's been launched in flight. But an axe is like an asteroid plunging through the atmosphere, hitting the Earth, destroying everything, and killing the dinosaurs. The axe is a cutting weapon, quite simple. And using it in any other way than to cleave in two what's in front of it is probably an ineffective use of the weapon. And we see that in the clip, that a lot of hits with the butt, a lot of strange uses of the axe. I don't think a Viking would typically do that. So in a fight, they would want to apply pressure, 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 pressure. We do see examples of Vikings fighting with different weapons in each hand, but it's not common. Much more typical would be a weapon in one hand, shield in the other, and the shields were the primary defense of Vikings. Someone without a shield was thought to be defenseless. Viking duels were highly formalized forms of one-on-one combat with a strict set of laws and a strict set of methods for doing it. It was one-on-one combat where you could not move. The two fighters stood stationary during the fight, and it was trading blows. So first the challenged man did an attack on the challenger, then the challenger did an attack on the challenged man. And this continued until either somebody died or the first blood spilled on the ground below them. And duelers brought 3 shields with them to the dueling site because they knew it was likely that a shield would break. And so if a shield broke, they'd throw it away and pick up a fresh one during the duel. So what we see in this clip is a shield being swung around wildly like, a knuckle duster. We don't have evidence that Vikings did that very much. The shield was a defense, and any other use was probably sort of last ditch. So in the Viking Age, shields were round, made of wood, with an iron boss in the center, and you grip the shield from behind the boss. There's a grip back there. There's no straps that the arm passes through, so the shield can rotate pretty freely. Now, the shield in actual use was a defense. You held it tight to the body, and that is to allow you to deliver powerful blows with your sword. Now, it's possible to have the shield swinging around, but in order to deliver a blow with the shield way out here, you're wide open for a possible counterattack as you're delivering the strike. I would call both of those sort of standard Hollywood stereotypical fights. You could take away the Viking clothing, take away the Viking weapons, and substitute clothing and weapons from some other culture, and the fight on the screen would be exactly the same. Their attacks were relentless, trying to achieve this austere, this word glory. You might kill your enemy with a slice or a jab, but that wouldn't give you this word glory. What would give you word glory is by splitting your opponent in two. So they were looking for these powerful attacks. And that kind of mindset really seems to be missing in this clip. So I would rate this clip about 4 for realism.
When we crack this mountain open, all hell is going to break loose.
Now, one thing that this film surprisingly gets absolutely right is the formations that were used in these battles. You can see them sketching it in the sand. Vikings didn't use lines across the battlefield that advanced, as we often see in these clips, but rather they used columns. So in the sketch, we have 3 columns that are advancing, and that would be very typically the Viking way. There's actually extremely limited evidence that Vikings used catapults. And the projectiles Vikings preferred were, of course, arrows, spears, and the king of Viking weapons, stones.
What is that?
The strongest and most capable fighters would be at the very tip, along with the person holding the battle standard. So this would be the king's hirth, his bodyguard, his prized fighters. Also with him would be his berserks. It's very likely that Viking kings had levy armies. In other words, farmers who were trained in the use of weapons, that had weapons available to them, who were required to come and serve the king in battle when called, when danger came to their land. They're wearing very stereotypical Viking helmets with horns. And there's just absolutely no evidence that Viking helmets had horns. We really wish they did, because that would be so cool. Way before the Viking Age, there's pictorial sources that show ceremonial helmets that did have elaborate horns. But that wasn't Viking. The typical Viking helmet was a simple bowl with some sort of guard over the front of the face.
Where did Hiccup go wrong?
He showed up.
He didn't get eaten.
He's never where he should be.
Thank you, Astrid.
Viking houses were long and narrow. They were called longhouses for a reason. So the expansive room that we see in this clip was probably not typical for Vikings. Now, one thing that's really interesting about this clip is the young boy is sort of wandering around looking for a place to sit, and that was not at all the Viking way. Your seating position was chosen for you by the master or mistress of the hall, and you did not change. Young children were at the very bottom, so the boy would probably be sitting at the far end, either end of the house, far from the light, far from the heat, and maybe even sitting on the floor. I would give this clip a 4. In the clip, we see someone, a warrior, wearing mail armor, and the universal defense would have been a shield. Virtually everyone carried a shield. And if they had anything more than that, it was probably much less likely. So it would be someone at the level of the king or the king's men. A mail shirt is exceedingly difficult to make in terms of time. The typical mail shirt might easily have 30,000 rings. Each one has to be riveted shut around its neighboring rings to form the fabric. Viking warriors expected that their shields might break. They were considered expendable. So they were round, they were made of wood, so wood planks, and there's an iron boss in the center. Typical shields were quite a bit bigger than this, even as much as 36 inches. So in our test, just one hit with a two-handed axe to a shield destroyed it. So in one case, the shields are limp and loose down by the side, and that would not be typical for a Viking shield. You'd really want it tight and close to your body to provide the defense you need, while still allowing you to use your weapon hand for delivering powerful blows. And then in the other instance, he is holding it close to the body. That's essential for absorbing and deflecting the force of that weapon. I would rate this clip around 3. It's very much in a fantasy world with some fantasy weapons and fantastic elements going on. There's two main categories of Viking ships. Merchant ships were meant to be primarily powered by sail and only occasionally by oar coming into land. Warships, on the other hand, were designed to be rowed fairly routinely. So they were extremely efficient in their design so that the rowers could get high speeds and they didn't tire themselves on long trips while rowing. The warships were long and narrow. This one that we see in the clip, I'd say the proportions are a little bit off, but a lot of the details are more or less correct. Now, the thing that was way off was rowing the Viking ship. What we see in the clip, these people don't scarcely have their oars in the water. They're not going to be able to deliver much power in the stroke. And they're not putting their body into it. My organization, Herstwick, has done some experiments with rowing a Viking ship and tried several different rowing styles to see which was the most efficient. And so based on our measurements, this long, slow stroke that uses the low muscles of the body was the one that gave 30% more speed to the ship than any other stroke we tested. And also the rowers reported that at the end of each run, that was the one that was the least fatiguing.
Now comes the true test. Now.
Surviving archaeological examples of Viking ships have material, equipment outboard of the hull. And if you come up to a pier or a dock, that stuff will just get ripped right off. So it seems unlikely that Viking ships were routinely brought up to a pier or dock. And the typical way of landing a Viking ship was just simply sail it up onto a sandy beach. And we even see evidence of that in the surviving archaeological examples. The keel is rubbed by sand. Yeah, I would give this clip a rating of 4. The costumes are wrong. The armor that we see is wrong. The rowing is wrong. At least the ship is okay. This hail of arrows was something that Vikings did. They would have called it driva, like literally a hail of arrows falling down on the opponents. And this film clip seems to show that pretty nicely, this intense hailstorm of arrows. What's a bit off is how the archers are using their bows. Now, we don't know a lot about the bows of the Viking Age. Because they're made of wood, they disintegrate. Almost every single pictorial source from the Viking Age, not only from Viking lands but other lands as well, shows a very different style of drawing the bow. We think of like modern competitive archers or the Robin Hood style of archers. You pull the arrow back to your head. All the pictorial sources show them drawing the arrow down to their hip. And so I would have hoped to have seen something like that. The modern idea that Vikings threw their axe is a misconception. If you look at the physics of an axe, they're very poorly suited for throwing in combat. And so in the Viking world, it would have been a last resort. The axe spins as it flies. So there's only a very small moment when the axe is in the right position to hit the target. In terms of cutting a rope with a sword, that's no problem at all. Just a single stroke will do it. In order to test them, We want to use a stand-in for human flesh and bone, and the best stand-in we've been able to find is animal carcasses, typically pig carcasses. So we'll do test cuts with replica sharp weapons against a pig carcass to see if the weapon cuts the way we expect, to see if we see the same marks on the skeleton that we see in the skeletal remains from the Viking Age. These things are highly destructive. I would give this clip a rating of 5. The details of the archery and the draw were probably off, but that flight of arrows was realized on the screen beautifully. It probably looked very much like that. And that is not how Viking ships were intended to be used, especially the warships. They would just sail up onto the beach, the warriors would jump over and be ready to fight literally instantly. And because the ships were so shallow draft, they knew that if they just jumped overboard, they would not be in any water any deeper than their knees. So Vikings did transport their horses by sea, but not in any way like what is shown in this clip. What we see in the clip is warships, and warships simply had no room for horses. If horses had to be transported, they'd be transported in merchant ships. More importantly, Vikings did not carry horses with them for war. They were sea people. If they arrived on land and needed a horse to ride to battle, they'd just steal one. In a battle, they dismounted and fought on foot. You're not going to achieve this word glory in killing someone on horseback. You're going to do it by standing in front of them and splitting them in two.
King John said that
When the warriors raise the weapons over their heads, we can see a variety of weapons that are far removed from what we would have seen in the Viking Age. Two-edged axe, that was not used in the Viking Age at all, and not even in later medieval times when the film apparently was set. We see some really strange pole weapons, almost halberd-like, that would have not come into the battlefield until centuries later. We see some swords that have proportions more like a katana than a Viking sword or a medieval European sword. It's not like the king had some particularly gigantic axe and everyone else had something smaller. I just think it depended more on what the individual warrior wanted. All has to do with penetration power. So a really short head is going to penetrate deeper with the same level of swing, and a longer head a little bit more. But it also gives you more flexibility in targeting, too, if the edge is longer. The other aspect is the shape can also be used defensively for hooking. Our tests in simulated combat suggest that the hooking shape is indeed a valuable defense. This clip, I think I would rate a 3. The weapons are wrong. The use of the ship is way wrong. Just many things are off. This kind of shield wall is much more like a Roman testudo. So something that covers over the top, something that people move in, something that's at the front of the line. We know of 2 battle formations they used. One is the shield wall, Skjaldborg. The other formation that I'd like to mention is the boar snout, and Vikings use that only rarely, and the descriptions of it vary from place to place. But again, they'd form into a wedge shape, and it would be used to drive their way through the opponent. And so I don't see either of those formations in this clip. If one of the opposing fighters actually was able to approach the shield wall with a sword, the battle was essentially over. What we see here, where they're hacking much over the top of the shields, it's something really common in the reenactor world. One more thing that's completely missing from this clip. We have good descriptions of mass battles between Vikings and Vikings, but also between Vikings and other cultures, such as the Anglo-Saxons. And these battles always start with projectiles, and I didn't see any projectiles being thrown in this clip. I would rate this clip a 4. Some of the weapons we see are off, and the clothing is just dull and boring, and Vikings weren't like that. They're all dirty and dark clothing, and Vikings loved bright colors, and they were very clean people. We know a fair amount about naval battles because there's quite a bit of detail in the sources on how Vikings fought at sea. But what was laughably funny about this clip was the people doing the throwing. So there's two specialized spears that seem to be for naval battle in the Viking Age. One of them is snarespjot, a stringed spear. We can increase the range immensely and put a lot more power into the spear by throwing it with a string wrapped around the spear. And so it's, I would have expected to see these throwing strings. The other spear is just a long, overgrown spear, a spear on steroids. And rather than throwing, it was more used for jabbing as the ships approached. The ships approach side to side, and that's not the way Vikings did it. They approached bow to bow, so front to front. And once they had touched, they'd grapple, they'd pull themselves in. That's when the battle really began in earnest. Their goal was to go the full length of the ship to kill the person in the stern. So it was like a land battle fought on a floating island, the deck of a ship. You're forcing your way through, throwing everything off to the sides, forcing their way through to get to the king. Can you imagine the kind of courage it took to do this and the word glory you would achieve if you did, in fact, kill the king? So that part of the battle was pretty far off. I really expected to see a lot more of that kind of motion in a naval battle. Because they had no shields, they were using their swords as a defense. And the way they use their swords is as if they believe that no matter what you do, they're not going to break. While Viking swords had a lot of strength, if you do edge-on-edge contact, very likely you're going to create some sort of chip, and subsequent hits are going to cause that crack to propagate along the length of the blade, and the blade is going to break. And Vikings were very sensitive to that. So the funeral we see in this clip is every person's preconceived idea of what a Viking funeral was like, but not in any way supported by any source. Some Vikings were put into a boat or a ship, and the ship was buried, and the whole thing covered over. Some Vikings were put into a ship or a boat and burned, but it was always done on land. Suppose you did set a ship on fire, send it out, it's going to burn to the water line, the sea is going to put out the fire, and the remnants are going to drift back to land. That's not going to be very pretty. I'm going to have to rate this clip somewhere around the 5, only for the fight. The fight had the power and the intensity and the relentlessness that we would expect to see in Vikings.
Hi, my name is Evan Wilson. I'm a professor at the U.S. Naval War College, and I'm an expert in 18th century naval warfare. So if you're desperate and you're being chased by someone who you know is stronger than you, you would throw things overboard if you're trying to speed up, but the thing that's really going to lighten the ship is throwing the guns overboard. I mean, that's the fastest way to lighten it. A 32-pound cannon or something like that weighs 7,000 pounds. What they're throwing overboard is like a single cannonball isn't going to make any difference in the speed of your ship. This is a maneuver that's called club hauling. You drop an anchor off the side and then attempt to rapidly turn the ship in another direction. It did happen, but you did it in an emergency when you were trying to extricate your ship from a very dangerous situation, rather than as a tactic in battle usually. You could surprise a Black Pearl, but it's going to take many minutes for this maneuver to happen. I mean, it is a surprise because it's really dumb. So that's chain shot. That's a real thing. It's either an anti-personnel thing because it's going to spin, or you fire it at the rigging in the hopes of cutting ropes as it spins through. I'd be surprised if you have a one-shot thing that brings the mast down like that. A good naval gun crew that's got a lot of men on it can load and fire a cannon in a minute, but you probably couldn't sustain that for very long. It looks like there are like 8 people on the ship, like I said, so you know, they could fire one gun, but not all of them. You need a lot of men. It's a great way to make yourself a target. Probably much more likely to end up in between the ships, which is a great way to get crushed to death. It's very cinematic, it's very evocative, and it looks like sort of a Tarzan-esque thing. I get that, but you're asking for trouble, and I think when people are firing at you, doing that is not smart. One of the things you don't see here is that it's actually really hard to keep two ships right next to each other. We saw these ships moving in opposite directions. Something would have needed to have happened to keep them near each other. Right now, this is just very conveniently, I guess they've anchored next to each other so that they can duke it out. Like in the Pirates universe, this is a 10 out of 10. It's about as accurate as they ever get. In reality, it's like a, I don't know, 4 out of 10.
This is your last warning. Stop now.
They showed a couple shots there of the crowded deck of what we know is a British frigate. That's much more accurate. I mean, these ships are going to be crawling with men. So that's a pretty risky strategy to try to knock down the mainmast of the enemy ship because masts are hard to hit. But firing into the rigging was a real tactic because the masts are held up by the rigging. So the reason you'd want to knock the enemy mast down is to disable his ship, and then he couldn't chase you anymore, and then you could just leave. Often the British practiced firing hard and low into enemy hulls, into the enemy ship, with the idea of killing men, not to sink the ship. It's really hard to sink a wooden ship. Wood floats. Instead, what you're doing is you're trying to kill the crew. The knock-on effect of that is that you can either board them and take them, or they'll be so disabled and so damaged that they will surrender to you, and then you can go take possession. Those are ropes that they're throwing over to try to get the ships to stay together, to solve that problem of the ships moving apart. It's really hard to get two ships to actually get close enough together to board. Ships have something called a tumble home. The hull is shaped so that the sides aren't straight up and down. The sides actually turn in a little bit, which means that when two ships are next to each other, they both have tumble homes that are going this way, which means that the cross from one deck to the other is actually a long way. The challenge of actually getting two ships next to each other to board them is real. They do a good job in this movie of showing you that there are different ways that you can go about doing it. I mean, they got almost everything right. This is a 10 out of 10. That's supposed to be sort of the bowsprit. That's the mast that sticks out the front of the ship. That's really essential to hold up most of the rigging of a ship. If you were to put elaborate metal claws on the front of it, you'd, first of all, probably not be able to sail the ship very well. Secondly, be very heavy on the front of your ship and cause your ship to go like this. You can run your ship into the other ship and then board it from there, but you do that by just clambering over your own bowsprit. You don't do it by staging an elaborate entrance in which, once again, just like with the Tarzan rope thing, you just made yourself a target, right? I mean, they stand there shocked that it's Euron, but just shoot him. Flaming arrows, I would say no. That's not something that would work, mainly because to make a flaming arrow work, you probably have to light it on your own ship. And fire is by far the biggest threat to ships. Wood, canvas, pitch, tar, this stuff is really flammable. Firing flaming arrows at someone else's ship is much more likely to set your own ship on fire than to set the other guy's ship on fire. The fact that they correctly identify that one of the greatest fears for a fleet would be fire, and that would be the thing that would make Euron scary, I think is accurate. The two ships are about to be on fire. That would be very bad. That would be catastrophic. You would be much more concerned about the fire than about whatever the enemy's doing. Would you keep fighting in a storm? The answer is it would affect tactics, but it wouldn't necessarily keep you from fighting. There's a famous example of two British frigates chasing a much larger French ship in 1797, and normally if the weather had been calm, the two frigates probably would have run away from the bigger French ship. But because the storm was so bad, the French ship couldn't open its lower gun ports because the water would have come in too low, right? So the French ship was basically half as powerful as it would have been. I don't feel like I need to explain that, but I can if you want. What's the name of the carnival ride? That's what they clearly saw that at a carnival, and they were like, let's make that happen. The guy swings like Tarzan, comes around, fires a gun, and then gets shot in the face. Because of course he would, because you see a guy swinging, you're like, I'm gonna shoot you now. Boarding is risky, right? When you board another ship, you need to be pretty confident that you are superior to the enemy that you're boarding. Because if you board an enemy ship and it goes poorly, then you might lose your own ship. Whereas if you hadn't bothered to board them in the first place, you probably wouldn't get captured. And you'd be much more likely to just obliterate them at a distance, and then once they surrender, take over the ship and say, well, that was better. A lot of movies have boarding in them because it's very cinematic, and it's a lot more interesting than watching two ships just fire at each other for a long time. That's a 1. War at Sea is not a carnival ride. That's just... Look at the way that the wind is blowing the sails of the British ship from behind and the sails of the other ship from that direction. I mean, that's a really good illustration of the wind doesn't work like that. The wind is, has been disengaged from this scene so that these ships can turn however they like. A lot of the times in the Age of Sail clips that we've been seeing, you know, they're turning the ship's wheel kind of like you're just sort of spinning it, like, I'm just gonna throw it this way and spin it. Like, usually it took 2 guys. It would take 2 people there to, you know, really work the wheel, because you're turning a really large piece of wood in water. So you turn the wheel, and that turns, moves ropes that are connected to the tiller, that are connected to the rudder, and the rudder does steer the ship. So you do need to spin the wheel, but often these ships are turning on a dime with nothing happening in the sails, and you're expected to believe that that's how it worked. So you would turn the wheel to do that, but you'd also do 1,000 other things, and the wind would have to be just right in the right place, and it would take a while. These ships are passing each other very quickly. I mean, the combined speed there is like, I don't know, 15 miles an hour. The number of seconds you'd probably have in which the enemy ship was in just the right position to fire on it would be very few. And so you'd end up with them just, you know, you do a little bit of damage and then the ship would just sail on. You could double up on an enemy ship like that, and there are famous examples of it. At the Battle of the Nile in 1798, the British do this to the French. It's a great way to do a lot of damage because it forces the enemy to fire on both sides, to figure out which way, you know, to concentrate. They do a good job actually here of showing the splinters, and the one realistic thing about this clip is that the air gets filled with splinters, and splinters were the real danger. That was what hurt you. You're very unlikely to be hit by an actual cannonball. It happened, of course, but the splinters are the thing here. Like, these things are coming at you know, bullet speeds. There are famous examples of ships exploding. They're rare, but certainly they did happen. The magazine is where you store the powder. If the magazine catches fire, then you'd see a major explosion. Like, an iron cannonball doesn't bring with it any explosive power. There's nothing that goes boom there. It's just a solid iron ball. So it's unlikely that an enemy shot is going to cause a magazine to explode. It's not something you could really aim for. It's much more likely that some fire got started on board that then spread to the magazine. Because remember, all the guns on that ship need sparks in order to ignite the powder to get them to fire. So there's a lot of flames in and around powder on board a ship, and if something goes wrong, you could have that happen. Wood floats, right? Wood doesn't take a nosedive and be like, well, I'm done floating now, you know, see ya. There'd be wreckage everywhere, and all that wreckage would float. You'd end up with water coming in the hold, and it would sink slowly over time. Certainly not after a single pass from 2 ships sailing in the opposite direction on a magical wind. So this clip is a 2, mainly because of the splinters, and ships did explode, but all the sailing stuff is ludicrous. Yeah, I don't know what to say about that. What happens when a ship goes downhill? I don't know. I'd be much more concerned about the wave and the curvature of the earth there than the enemy ships, but that's a fantasy element we can leave aside. Rowing a ship using human power is pretty inefficient. The way to get your ship going fast enough to do any damage with the ram means that the rest of the ship needs to be pretty light, and you need a lot of rowers. They've done some testing on this. The answer is an untrained crew could get a trireme going maybe 9 knots, which is like a jog. It's like 8 miles an hour, right? So yeah, it's not that fast. The way that they're sort of moving relatively slowly as they approach the ship is, sure. And then it's like sort of accelerated at the end and went, and then the ship bent. You could probably poke a hole in the guy's ship if you really were going to try to ram the guy, and you would aim for the middle of the other guy's ship because that probably would be the weakest part. But you're unlikely to sink him because, again, wood floats. It's really hard to sink ships. What you're more likely to do is just damage him enough that you can board him. But what doesn't work in this clip is that the vessels that you would expect to see here are fair weather ships, right? So galleys, triremes, that sort of thing. These are not all-weather vessels that are going to handle a big sea. These ships would be mainly struggling to survive rather than able to fight much. Maybe it's a 5. Yeah, they had triremes. They fought like this, sort of.
Their boat is turning into more boats!
The division of the pirate ship into small ships to send them out to attack the small ship doesn't make a ton of sense to me. You'd use the small boats on your big ship to tow you places in a flat calm sometimes if it were an emergency. But otherwise, the little boats that you've got are not going to help do much. A smaller maneuverable ship could theoretically run away from big ships in the right conditions. The speed of a ship depends on about 1,000 different factors. You're going to deal with the wind direction, the wind speed, which direction the ship is trying to go relative to the wind. Moana and Maui are going to be more maneuverable. They're going to be able to sort of change direction very quickly. I think for realism, you know, it's a 6. I mean, they're coconut pirates, so let's not get too carried away. So now's probably a good time to talk about range. The guns that they're firing in this period are not usually rifled, right? So they have smoothbore barrels, which means that the cannonball is slightly smaller than the barrel, which means that as it fires down the barrel, it's got windage, so it can bounce around the barrel as it goes, and then it goes off there. So they're not particularly accurate, right? Think of a musket as opposed to a rifle. That said, they can throw a ball really far. So the muzzle velocity of a 32-pound cannon here is like 1,500 feet per second, or I think Mach 1.3. It's going faster than the speed of sound. And so you could hit something at maybe a mile. Whether you could hit what you were aiming at a mile, less clear. But at a mile, you could probably, if you got the pitch just right and you hit it on the roll, you could get a ball to go that far. Unlike most movies that immediately shrink the battlefield down to right next to each other, it does a good job of sort of showing that, yeah, you could actually open up at a pretty good range and expect maybe to hit something. Ideally, you'd want to be within a quarter of a mile. You'd only do that in very short ranges. Ships are constantly moving, right? And they're moving faster than you can swim. So the idea that you would be able to risk swimming across to an enemy ship, and then when you board it, there'd be enough of you to actually do something with it is very unlikely. In a fleet battle like this, it's very rare. What they did at Trafalgar, this lieutenant swam across to a French ship and then managed to get ropes tossed to him so that they could grapple the ships together, again, to board it. But it's within range of someone to be able to throw a rope, not like a mile or whatever the distance is here. Would you do it at that range? No. Would you open up guns at that range? It looks pretty far to me, but it's hard to judge distances here. So I'll say 7. That weird funnel of ships was strange. There are a lot of collisions that are about to happen in that fleet right there, so you wouldn't get that close to each other. But they're basically trying to form a line of battle. Forming a line of battle was a technique developed in the middle of the 17th century, in the 1650s, roughly. And it was a defensive technique. So you form ships in a line of battle, one after the other, lined up like this. Remember that ships' guns, the most powerful ones, fire sideways, but ships sail forward, right? You line up all the ships in your fleet, one after the other like this in a line, so that the weakest part of every ship, the bow and the stern, is facing a friend. The most dangerous part is facing the bad guy. You form a really effective defensive barrier that means that it's very difficult for the enemy to do anything to you because you can keep them at bay with your massive, powerful guns all lined up. And that's called the line of battle. And it basically is the major fleet tactic for the next 150 years. If you had a solid line of battle that wouldn't get broken, then chances are you weren't going to lose the battle. That gun sort of gently rolled back when it fired. Like, that's not nearly violent enough. 7,000 pounds moving backwards 10 to 11 feet, you wouldn't really even see it. It would be so fast because the thing that's going out the front is going out at Mach 1.3. Now that put a huge amount of stress on the ship's side because it meant that the bolts that held it to the ship's side had 16 tons of force pulling them that way every time you fire the gun. So one of the things that they learn over time is don't fire every single gun on the ship at the same time. Do a rolling broadside so that you don't exert 16 tons of power on every single bracket on every single side of your ship. So bang, 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 not kaboom, right? It wouldn't necessarily tear the ship to pieces, but it certainly put more stress on it than it would if you sort of staggered the firing a little bit. To fire these cannon, put the slow match on the touch hole. Well, all that's doing is igniting a stream of powder, a fuse that's going to go down the touch hole into the actual charge. And then sometime in the next 2 or 3 seconds, the cannon's going to fire. But I can't exactly predict it, which again makes aiming really hard because the ship is moving in all sorts of directions, right? It's going forward, it's going, pitching and rolling and yawing and all these other dimensions. They do a good job of actually showing slow match in this clip, but they don't, the guns don't recoil fast enough and there's not enough sort of uncertainty about it. This is probably an 8.